The morning they put the Harwick Brewing Company on the auction block, the sky over Kellerton, Pennsylvania had the particular November quality that descends on that part of the state before the first snow of a season, not threatening exactly, but withholding all warmth with deliberate intent, the clouds flat and low and the color of old pewter pressed down over the ridge above town. By the end of this story, I'm also going to share something special with those of you who stick around to the end, something that can help you in your personal life. But first, let's get back to Clara Dunmore sat in the third row of folding chairs inside the county courthouse meeting room with a paper cup of coffee going cold in both hands, and her barn coat still buttoned to the collar against a chill the building's radiators had not yet answered. 20 or so chairs had been arranged in 4 rows facing a folding table at the front, and roughly 14 of them held bodies. 2 men in matching canvas work coats near the back carried matching clipboards, and the practiced stillness of people who bid at county auctions the way other people go to the grocery store, not with excitement, not with dread, but with a list and a method and the settled calm of routine. A real estate attorney in a charcoal blazer sat on the aisle, his phone face down on his knee, tapping one finger against the case in the small patient rhythm of a man waiting for the specific thing he came for and not interested in anything else. 3 farmers in a cluster at the left end of the second row had driven in from Sycamore Township for the agricultural parcels. A young couple near the front, early 30s, held a printed sheet of property listings and spoke to each other in low, urgent voices, the particular murmur of people who have run the numbers twice and are trying to feel calm about what they are about to spend. Nobody was there for Lot 47. Lot 47 was the Harwick Brewing Company at 19 Mill Street, Kellerton, Pennsylvania. One commercial structure, brick and limestone. Construction date approximate 1889. Total parcel 1.5 acres, which included a main building of roughly 11,000 square feet, a detached loading dock of unknown structural integrity, and a cellar of unknown depth. Appraised tax value $300. The $300 was not a real number. No one looking at 11,000 square feet of 19th century masonry and believing their own eyes could hold that number in mind as anything but a formality. It was the county assessor's way of acknowledging that a property can fall below any calibrated system designed to measure value and still take up space on the books, and that the county needed the space and the obligation both to go to someone else. The auctioneer reached Lot 47 at 11:17 in the morning. He read the address from his sheet in the flat, efficient voice of a man who has been reading addresses out loud for several hundred consecutive workdays and sees no reason to vary his approach for the last one of the morning. Harwick Brewing Company, 19 Mill Street. Minimum bid $300. The room said nothing. Clara raised her hand. The auctioneer noted it without visible reaction. $300. He waited the required 10 seconds. His eyes moved once across the room. The 2 men with clipboards did not look up from their pages. The attorney had picked up his phone. Sold. Lot 47. $300. The hand Clara's daughter Patricia had placed on her forearm at some point during the waiting, she could not have said exactly when, tightened slightly. Patricia Dunmore Greer was 38 years old and worked as a financial analyst for a consulting firm in Harrisburg, and she had driven up that morning after Clara had called the night before to say she was thinking about bidding on something at the county auction and would Patricia like to come up. Patricia had come. Clara understood this to be a measure of how much her daughter was still carrying around on her behalf, for years on from her father's death, the watchful kind of love that does not know how to fully stand down. "Mom," Patricia said. Her voice was careful and level and kind in the way that careful and level and kind sometimes carries more weight than its words. "I know," Clara said. She stood and carried her cold coffee to the registration table by the door. She gave her name and her check and received in return a manila envelope containing a transfer certificate and a ring of old brass keys, 9 of them, looped on a length of stiff wire. The keys were the kind that belonged to a time before everything was keyed alike, each one differing from the others in some small but specific way that had once encoded information someone considered important. She turned the ring once in her hand. Then she put it in her coat pocket. Patricia was quiet in the car on the way back to Maple Avenue. They turned into the drive and sat for a moment with the engine off and the silver maple out front dropping its last leaves in no visible wind. $300, Patricia said. And fees. Probably $450 total when the county processes everything. Mom. I know, honey. They went inside. Clara put the kettle on, and Patricia sat at the kitchen table with her coat still on and looked at the manila envelope her mother set between them the way a thoughtful person looks at a document they have been asked to assess for someone they cannot be professionally objective about. You could have called me first, Patricia said, before you went. I would have thought about it for too long. That was kind of the point of calling me. Clara set a cup of tea in front of her daughter and sat across from her. Outside the kitchen window, the silver maple dropped another leaf, and then another. The radiator under the window ticked as the heat came on. Your father loved that building, Clara said. Dad has been gone 4 years, Patricia said. She said it gently. She always said the hard things gently, which was a quality she had inherited directly from Frank, and which Clara both loved and found, on this particular morning, slightly difficult to sit with. I know he has. Patricia looked at her mother for a long moment, and then let the thing she had been about to say settle back down unspoken. She picked up her tea. She did not push. Glenn called that evening. Glenn was Patricia's husband, a patient, methodical man who approached the problems of life the same way he approached his spreadsheets, by building a framework first and drawing conclusions after. He had a structural engineer he wanted Clara to speak with, a woman named Deborah Hartza, who had assessed historical commercial properties all over Pennsylvania and who could give Clara a professional opinion on what she had actually acquired. He said it the way reasonable people say things they have thought through carefully and want you to hear as reasonable, which it was, and which was not quite the point. Clara wrote the name on the notepad by the phone. She thanked Glenn. She set the notepad on the counter, where it sat for 3 days. She ran into a former colleague the following morning at the grocery store on Main Street. Rosaria Volpe had taught Spanish at Kellerton High for 26 years and retired the same June as Clara, and had since filled her days with a purposefulness Clara admired. Rosaria was someone who had always known what needed to happen next and never needed a sealed cellar to tell her. She had heard about the auction. In a town of 20,000 where the county register and the social graph overlap almost entirely, you hear things. The old brewery, Rosaria said, over the frozen food section, the door hanging open between them. Clara, you know the county pulled the occupancy certificate on that building in 2006. There was a structural report. Where did you hear about a structural report? Marjorie Fleischhauer, from the Historical Preservation Committee. She mentioned it at the library fundraiser 2 years ago. She used the word catastrophic and then corrected herself to say potentially catastrophic, and I remember thinking that was not a very strong correction. The building has been standing for 135 years, Clara said. That was before the last 4 decades of nobody caring for it. Clara paid for her groceries and drove home and sat at the kitchen table with the county's transfer certificate in front of her and the ring of keys beside it. She thought about Rosaria, about Glenn, about Patricia, about the phrase potentially catastrophic. She thought about Frank pointing at the loading dock on a Saturday afternoon in the fall of 2017, and she thought about her grandfather Emil at 23 in a photograph she had looked at the day before the auction until she could not look at it anymore. She was not impulsive. No one in 63 years had described her as impulsive. She had spent 35 years teaching students to sit with an uncertainty long enough to find out whether it was genuine uncertainty or merely discomfort, and she had learned in the process to tell the difference in herself. What she felt at that kitchen table was not the uncertainty of a bad decision. It was the discomfort of a decision she had not yet made fully visible to herself. She went back on a Monday morning. Clara Dunmore had grown up in Kellerton the way people grow up in small Pennsylvania cities when they are the children of teachers and mill workers. Knowing the texture of every sidewalk block between the house and the school, and the specific height of the river in different seasons, and the names of the families in the houses on every street in a 12-block radius. She had not always loved the town. There were years in her 20s when she had thought seriously about Philadelphia or Pittsburgh or somewhere with faster rhythms and a wider cultural orbit, years when the smallness of the place felt like pressure against the edges of herself. But she had met Frank Dunmore in the biology department at Kellerton High, where she had already been teaching English for 3 years, and Frank was from Harrisburg and had come to Kellerton for a job and had liked the town in the unstudied way people like places when they have not been told whether they are supposed to. He liked the river and the ridge and the old neighborhoods and the particular density of a town built on actual industry, with the bones of that industry still visible in the brickwork and the loading yards and the empty factory buildings along Mill Street that had not yet been converted into anything and were therefore, he said, still honest. Frank's love of old buildings was not decorative. It was the same instinct that made him a good biology teacher, the habit of looking at a thing carefully enough to see how it was built and what the building was for. He could walk through an empty commercial building and read its intention the way a person reads a sentence, from the structural logic, the way the windows related to the work that once happened inside them, the way the floor plan encoded a way of organizing human activity that had once seemed so necessary and now seemed so remote. He was not sentimental about the past, but he was genuinely curious about it, and Clara had come to love the specificity of that curiosity across 31 years of marriage. The way he wanted to know not just that a thing existed, but how it worked and why someone had decided it needed to exist in that particular form at that particular scale. He had known August Harwick's history. This was the thing. He had known who August Harwick was before Clara had thought to look it up, the German immigrant who had come to Pennsylvania in 1882 and started the brewery 7 years later with two partners who both departed the venture within the first decade and left August as the sole operator. Frank had known that the building's limestone foundation had been quarried from a local ridgeline, and that the brick above it had come on flat cars from a brickyard 60 miles south, and that the copper kettles August had ordered from Germany in 1891 had cost more than the entire lot they stood on. He knew these things the way he knew the life cycles of organisms he admired, with a pleasure that was also a form of respect. On a Saturday afternoon in the fall of 2017, for years before his diagnosis, Frank had stood in the gravel lot beside the Harwick Brewing Company on Mill Street and pointed at the arc of the loading dock with the particular pleasure of a man showing you something he understood well and was glad to share. You can tell it was designed by someone who thought about the movement of weight, he had said. The dock is positioned relative to the cellar access so that the barrels could be rolled from delivery straight down to fermentation without ever being lifted. Every inch of it was thought about. Someone spent real time on this before the first stone went in the ground. Clara had stood beside him in the cool afternoon light and looked at the building the way you look at something your person loves, with your attention and not necessarily your heart. She had not known then that she would need to remember that afternoon. She had not known that 4 years later she would be sitting in a waiting room outside a surgical consultation reading the same 3 paragraphs of a magazine article over and over while a surgeon came out to tell her things she had been preparing herself to hear for 6 months. Pancreatic cancer does not give you a long negotiation. You are arguing with a landlord who has already decided. Frank was diagnosed in March of 2020, which added a particular administrative misery to an already miserable year, and he died in February of 2022 with Clara holding one hand and Patricia holding the other in a gray Pennsylvania morning outside the hospice window that Frank, who had paid attention to weather his whole life, would have found interesting in spite of everything. He had been 61 years old. He was the kind of man the world is quieter without. The medical bills took 2 years to work through, and by the time Clara retired from teaching the following June, the account that had once held their retirement savings held something more modest and more carefully managed. Enough to cover the essentials and not very much more. Her pension was real. Her house was paid off. Her health was good. She told herself and her friend V regularly, fine. She had the house and the pension and the garden that still produced too much zucchini every summer, as if her mother's planting habits had been absorbed by the soil itself and were now running on their own terms without her. Fine, she told herself. Fine. She had started to wonder whether fine was the kind of thing you say when it is true or the kind you say when you need it to be and are trying to convince the air around you first. Her grandfather Emil had come to Kellerton from Slovakia in 1924 at the age of 20, following a cousin who had written letters back to the family describing America in terms persuasive enough to move a young man across an ocean. Emil was quiet and thick and deliberate in the way of men who work with their bodies and have learned that doing a thing carefully the first time takes less total time than doing it fast and correcting it. He had worked the mines near the ridge for one difficult year, and then found his way to the Harwick Brewing Company at 19 Mill Street, where he spent the first years loading barrels at the dock and later advanced to the fermentation floor. working under a German-born brewmaster named Otto who had very specific opinions about water temperature and malt-to-water ratios that he was prepared to defend at any length. Emil had worked at the Harwick Brewing Company until 1932. He mentioned this in Clara's presence exactly once, in the distracted way that older people sometimes mention settled history, not because it was hidden, but because it seemed to them too obvious to be interesting. Left in 32, he had said. The work was done. Clara had been 7. She had been coloring at the kitchen table. She had not asked what the work was. She would spend considerable time in the weeks ahead thinking about what the work was. The listing in the county register appeared on a Thursday in September. Clara had found it reading the register online that morning, a habit she had kept across her working years without ever fully examining it. Something about the register's dry accounting of the county's ongoing business satisfying the same instinct that made her a careful reader of everything she read. Lot 47. The Harwick Brewing Company. 19 Mill Street. Minimum bid $300. Auction date October 14th. She read it 3 times. Then she went to the window above the kitchen sink and stood there with her tea going cold in both hands, looking at the back garden and the fence and the neighbor's silver maple that would be dropping its leaves onto her side any week now. She thought about Frank in the parking lot on that Saturday in 2017. She thought about the way he had pointed at the loading dock with the careful pleasure of a man sharing something he understood well and was glad you were there to share it with. She thought about his voice saying, every inch of it was thought about. She thought about a building that no one was going to bid on, and what it meant for something to be so forgotten that the county had stopped pretending it had monetary value. She called V. Marvella Okafor. V to everyone who knew her past the first week of knowing her, had taught American history at Kellerton High for 29 years and had come to teaching from a graduate program at Penn State that she had left without finishing the doctoral degree because she had realized midway through it that she wanted to teach the subject rather than publish papers about it. She had never, in the 31 years Clara had known her, expressed a syllable of regret about this. She had a sharp, patient intelligence that did not announce itself loudly and that you became aware of after a while the way you become aware of a current in a river, less by feeling it directly than by noticing where everything around it is being carried. I want to bid on the Harwick Brewing Company at the county auction, Clara said over the phone. The minimum bid is $300, and I believe I may be the only one who bids. A pause that had the specific quality of V rearranging her assessment of what kind of conversation this was. For what purpose? V said. I'm not entirely sure yet. I want to go inside it. You have lived in Kellerton your whole life, and you have never gone inside it. The building was locked. People get into locked buildings all the time. Clara, what is actually pulling you toward this? Clara thought about it honestly before she answered. Frank's voice in the parking lot. Emil saying the work was done. The listing sitting between 2 notices she did not care about. The feeling she had carried for 4 years of watching months accumulate, without finding what the months were supposed to be building toward. I think something is in there that I should find, she said. I don't know what it is, but I think I should be the one who finds it. Another pause, and then $300. $300. Condition of the building. The limestone looks solid from the street. The brick is holding. The cast iron window frames are not sagging. I drove past it yesterday afternoon. From the car. It was raining a little. Clara, I know. A longer pause, and then V said, all right. I am not going to be the voice of pure reason here, because I am aware that the voice of pure reason is not always the most useful one in a room. Go to the auction. Buy your brewery. Call me the moment you are inside it. She went. She raised her hand. She paid $300 and drove home with the transfer certificate and the ring of keys. She went back on a Monday morning in the second week of October, with a good rechargeable flashlight and the ring of 9 brass keys, and her barn coat, and her work gloves, and her grandfather's voice somewhere at the back of her mind, saying something about the inside of a sleeping giant. She parked in the small gravel area beside the building and sat in the car for a moment looking at the exterior the way you look at a place before you enter it when you understand that entering will change your relationship to it in some permanent way. The building was larger than she had held in her mental image across all the years of walking past it on Mill Street. This was one of those perceptual surprises that happen when something you have carried as background imagery suddenly becomes a foreground reality, when the thing you have seen your whole life decides to show you its actual size. The brick above the limestone foundation was dark with weather and age, the color of dried clay in the shadowed sections, and a deep warm ochre in the places where the morning light caught it directly. The limestone itself was pale gray, close-fitted, the joints so tight between courses that you could barely press a finger into them. This was the mark of stone laid by someone who had expected the work to outlast them by a considerable distance and who had laid it accordingly. The windows on the upper floor were boarded from the inside, the plywood weathered to a soft gray, but the cast iron frames were still plumb and true in their settings. No lintel bowed. No sill had canted. Whatever else the decades had done to the building, the structure itself had simply stood and gone on standing. Above the limestone arch of the main entrance, the name Harwick had been carved into the stone in letters 8 inches tall, still crisp at their edges, still carrying the deliberateness of someone who cut them knowing they would be read a long time from now. Below the name, the date, 1889. The third key on the ring fit the lock on the main doors. Both panels swung inward together with a sound that was not quite a groan and not quite a sigh, but something between the two. The sound of a room that has been holding itself in and is now, without ceremony, letting go. The air that came out to meet her had its own specific character. Stone and old wood and dry yeast, and something mineral beneath those things, clean and cool and very faintly sweet. The particular sweetness of a space where grain and water and time have spent generations in each other's company. She stood on the threshold, breathing it in and not moving forward yet, the way you stand in the doorway of a room that has been closed for a long time before you are sure you belong inside it. The light on the main brewing floor came through the gaps in the plywood boarding in thin, pale, parallel stripes that fell across the oak planking at long angles, illuminating the dust that had settled over 4 decades into a soft, even coat. The floor had been worn smooth in the lanes of heaviest traffic, darker at the edges where dust had gathered undisturbed. The ceiling was high, perhaps 20 feet at the peak, carried on cast iron columns spaced at regular intervals down the length of the floor. The columns were rusted at their bases and darkened with age along their shafts, but they were standing as true as the day they were set, and the ceiling above them, a system of wooden beams pinned to iron rods, showed no sag and no shift in any direction her eye could find. Between the columns, anchored to the floor by their flanged bases and their own considerable weight, the copper kettles stood. There were 5 of them. Each one rose approximately 9 feet from base to sealed top, their copper surfaces oxidized over 43 years to a green-brown patina, the color of old coins or the underside of wet leaves in late autumn. Their conical tops were still sealed, their brass pressure gauges and valve stems still projected from their sides on short iron pipes, the needles in the gauges long since settled at 0, the valves closed and staying closed. She walked down the center of the floor between them with her flashlight adding its beam to the thin window light, and she looked at them as she passed. In 43 years the copper had not cracked or failed or developed any leak she could see. The metal had simply changed color, the way copper does when there is nothing protecting it from air, and the riveted seams along the sides of each kettle were still tight in their holes, every rivet still flush, the work of a craftsman who understood what he was making and made it for the long term. Frank would have stood here for a while. She made herself walk forward rather than stand missing him, which was a discipline she had been working on for 4 years without perfecting it. At the far end of the main floor a doorway opened into the fermentation room, lower ceilinged, the floor concrete rather than oak, the light from the high windows dimmer and grayer. The fermentation vessels here were long horizontal steel tanks mounted in iron frames along both walls, their surfaces gone to a deep red-brown rust, their hatches still sealed with butterfly bolts long since seized by corrosion. She walked the length of the fermentation room with her hand trailing along the side of one of the tanks, feeling the rough, dry texture of the rust through her gloves, the cold mass of the metal underneath. Near the supervisor's station at the far end of the room, a corkboard was still mounted to the wall. 3 production schedules, typewritten, were still pinned to it, July, August, and September of 1979. The type was still legible, and the paper was brittle at the edges but intact, each column of figures still clear. August had been their best month of that year by a margin she could read in the numbers. By September the figures were lower. She looked at the September schedule for a moment and thought about what the office conversations had probably been during that month, whether anyone had said the thing that everyone was beginning to understand, or whether they had all chosen to keep working and not say it yet. Up the iron staircase at the north end of the main floor, the upper level held the offices, 2 rooms separated by a glass partition, the glass still whole and still clear, not cracked, not fogged beyond what 43 Pennsylvania winters and 43 Pennsylvania summers would do to glass without maintenance. She put her hand flat against the glass, and it was cold and smooth, and she could see her own dim reflection in it from the brighter side, a tall woman in a barn coat standing in a room no one had stood in for 40 years. The larger office held 3 oak desks and a row of filing cabinets. 2 of the desks had their drawers pulled open and left that way, whatever they had held already removed. The third desk's top drawer was stuck or locked, and she chose not to force it. The filing cabinets along the far wall had been mostly emptied, their rails bare, the folders already taken by whoever had been the last to leave. Whatever records this office had once maintained had gone with the people who maintained them. In the smaller office, behind the glass, the ledgers had been left on the shelf above the single desk. 8 of them, bound in green cloth, the spines labeled by year range in a hand that had faded to near illegibility on the earliest volumes. She took the most recent one down and opened it on the desk. The script inside was the deliberate, upright handwriting of someone trained in a period when handwriting was a serious skill, and the care of forming each letter correctly was not considered a waste of a person's time. She read several entries: production volumes, ingredient orders, equipment maintenance records, payroll figures. The ordinary account of an ordinary business trying to sustain itself across the years. The final entry in the final ledger was dated the 6th of February, 1981. It was written in a different hand from the rest of the ledger, larger and less careful, in pencil where all the other entries had been in ink. It read, "Locked up for the last time tonight. 32 years of good work in this building. Tell the kettle I'm sorry." She closed the ledger very carefully. She set it back on the shelf between the others. She stood for a moment in the dim office with the closed partition glass and the empty desk and the row of green spines in front of her, thinking about the person who had written that sentence. Not a principal figure in the history of anything. A foreman or supervisor or bookkeeper who had spent 32 years doing their particular kind of careful work in this building and had been the one who turned off the lights at the end of the last day and found themselves wanting to say something to the machines they were leaving. Tell the kettle I'm sorry. She went back down the iron staircase. At the far end of the fermentation room, past the last of the rusted tanks, and down a short connecting corridor she had half noticed on her first pass through, was a door. It was heavier than any other door in the building, constructed of oak planking 2 inches thick and reinforced across its face, with 3 horizontal iron straps and a vertical center brace, the iron worn to a dull gray, but still sound. The hardware was a surface-mounted lever lock, a design more common in the 19-teens and 20s than in later construction, the kind built for serious repeated use. The largest key on the ring was a heavy iron key with a shaft as thick as her thumb and a bit shaped for a lever mechanism. She fitted it to the lock. She turned it. The bolt retracted with a heaviness that was not stiffness but mass, the way a well-built mechanism moves when it is working correctly and is simply carrying serious weight. The door swung inward on its hinges, both panels, heavy and slow and without complaint. A staircase went down. She counted the steps, 14. The walls on either side were limestone, the same quarried stone as the foundation visible from the street, the same pale gray surface that caught her flashlight beam and threw it back softened and diffused rather than sharp. The staircase was wide enough for 2 people to descend comfortably side by side, which told her something about what had been expected to use it. Not people primarily, but barrels, large and heavy and requiring wide lanes and the leverage of 2 workers side by side guiding them down. The cellar floor was packed earth, dry and hard as fired clay, worn smooth over decades of use to a surface that compressed under her boot heel without any give at all. The ceiling above was low, 7 feet or so at the center where the main vault of the space ran, lower at the margins where the limestone arches sprang from the side walls. The arches were hand-fitted, each stone shaped individually to its position in the curve, the kind of work that required both skill and time, and that you could still see the skill in across 130 years. She walked. The smell down here was different from the main floor. Cooler, deeper, the mineral note of the limestone stronger and more present. There was something else beneath those things, a warm sweetness she spent several minutes trying to identify. Old yeast, yes. Old wood, yes. And something else underneath those, something faint and complex and specific that she could not quite name, and that reminded her. Before we find out what happened next in the story, I want to take a brief moment to speak directly to anyone watching who might be going through their own sudden, overwhelming transition. If you are navigating a bitter divorce, the loss of a spouse, or a financial shock, you know the hardest part isn't just the money. It's not knowing what to do first. That is exactly why we created the Phoenix Blueprint. It is a practical, step-by-step guide for starting over. It doesn't have fluffy affirmations or vision boards. It is a tactical survival manual. It gives you the exact checklist for the first 48 hours, including the one rule you must follow. Do not make any decision you cannot reverse. It includes the Found Money worksheet, showing you exactly how to check state databases because 1 in 7 Americans actually has unclaimed money waiting for them right now. It even gives you word-for-word boundary scripts to use when family members pressure you for money or try to make decisions for you. You can get the entire guide right now for just $17. If you're watching on your TV, just pull out your phone, open your camera, and scan the QR code on the screen right now. If you're on a computer or phone, click the top link in the description. You don't have to figure this out alone. Now, let's get back to the story. When she stopped trying to name it and simply noticed it, of something she had smelled once in a very old library, the specific concentrated breath of a space that has held the same things for a very long time and taken on their character. Wooden shelving ran along both walls, the pine boards warped in the slow, patient way of wood that has been through many cycles of Pennsylvania temperature change and has adapted rather than failed. The shelves were empty now, swept out at some point before the building was locked, though not entirely. Here and there a barrel stave on the floor, a length of copper tubing that had rolled to the edge of the shelf and lodged against the wall below it, a wooden chock split along the grain, a length of braided cotton rope still tied in a bowline knot at one end. She walked with her flashlight sweeping left to right, the beam cutting clean through the cool darkness. 30 steps. 40. 50. The cellar was far longer than the footprint of the building above it would suggest. She knew cellars could extend beyond the walls of the structures they supported, particularly in old industrial buildings where subgrade storage exceeded above-ground capacity. But the length of this one felt deliberate rather than incidental, the way the width of the staircase had felt deliberate. As if the cellar had been designed for its own purposes, and the brewery above it had been built around those purposes rather than the other way. At 62 steps, the flashlight found the far wall. She stopped. The wall was limestone, as she had expected. But it was not the same limestone as the other 3 walls of the cellar, and she saw this before she had consciously articulated what was wrong. The way you register a wrong note in a piece of music before you can locate it by name. The stone was a shade lighter than the stone of the side walls, closer to white than gray, and the surface texture was subtly different, smoother, and less worn by the decades of cellar air and temperature cycling than the stone on the other 3 sides. The light from her flashlight played against it differently. The mortar in the joints was wrong, on the side walls and the near wall. The mortar had gone dark with age and absorbed moisture, settling into the joints until it was nearly the same tone as the stone on either side of it. On the far wall, the mortar was a full shade lighter, still closer to its original color. Not fresh, not recently applied. Old, but not the same age as the mortar on the other walls. Younger by what looked like a significant margin, the kind of margin you measure in decades rather than years. Someone had built this wall after the brewery was built. She moved the flashlight slowly across the face of the wall, horizontally first, from corner to corner, looking for a seam or a gap or any break in the continuous surface. Then vertically, from the packed earth floor to the curve of the limestone arch above. The wall was the full width of the cellar, 9 feet across. It ran from the floor to the ceiling without interruption. The top course of stones fitted precisely against the underside of the arch with the care of someone who had wanted the fit to be clean and to stay clean. She was looking for a door. There was nothing that looked like a door. The wall presented itself as exactly what it appeared to be, a wall, solid and continuous, and without a seam. She put her hand flat against the stone. It was cold and dry and told her nothing. She moved her palm 6 inches to the left and pressed again. She did this across the lower half of the wall in a slow grid, pressing and moving, feeling for any vibration or draft or variation in the temperature of the stone that might indicate a hollow space behind it. She felt nothing but cold stone. Her phone was at 8%. She made herself turn around. She made herself walk back the 62 steps across the packed earth floor, back past the empty shelves and the scattered staves, back up the 14 wide steps, back through the heavy oak door, which she locked behind her. She walked through the fermentation room and across the main floor and out through the main entrance into the cold October afternoon. She stood in the gravel lot with the keys in one hand and her flashlight in the other. The name Harwick looked down at her from the limestone arch in letters that had been there for 135 years. She drove to the diner on Commerce Street and texted V before she had her coat off. V arrived in 11 minutes, which meant she had either been nearby or had been waiting for a reason to come. She sat down across from Clara and looked at her with the steady attention that had always been V's distinguishing characteristic, the quality of someone whose looking is itself a form of careful thinking. "Tell me," V said. "There's a wall in the cellar that was built after the original construction," Clara said. "The stone is a different shade from the rest of the cellar walls, and the mortar is younger. It runs the full 9 feet from floor to ceiling with no seam or hinge visible anywhere on its face. And the cellar is longer than the building's footprint by what I estimate is at least 20 feet. V wrapped both hands around her coffee cup and looked at the table for a moment. "How long is the cellar?" she said. 62 steps before I reached the far wall." V was quiet for a beat. "Then, I looked up August Harwick this morning after you texted." Clara waited. "He died in September of 1932, V said. "He was 74 years old. He had built the brewery in 1889 with 2 partners who left within the first decade, and he ran it alone after that until his son Wilhelm, who went by William, took over day-to-day operations around 1910. The family owned the building until 1947, when William sold it to outside investors, and those investors ran it until 1981. And the estate," Clara said. "August Harwick's estate was not settled until 1936. For years after his death, his assets were listed in the settlement filing as complex and requiring extended evaluation. The settlement record is in the county archive, but it is either incomplete or some of its pages are missing from the copy that was filed. What appears is a settled sum that most observers at the time found surprisingly modest. There was a letter to the editor in the Kellerton Courier in 1936 from a man who described himself as a former business associate of August's, expressing his surprise at the smallness of the estate. He used the phrase considerably less than anyone familiar with August's affairs would have anticipated. Clara looked at her coffee cup. "Prohibition," she said. V held her cup in both hands and did not say anything yet. "What did August Harwick do during Prohibition?" Clara said. 1920 to 1933. 13 years. A man who had built one of the most productive brewing operations in the county. What does a man like that do for 13 years when his business is illegal? "There are a few options," V said. "He stops. He pivots to a legal near-beer product. He produces a legal product and manages the risk carefully." Or, Clara said, "He produces the legal product for the record and uses the proceeds from the other work to accumulate something else. Something not in any account. Something that would not appear in an estate filing." "Like what?" V said. But her voice had the specific quality it got when she already had the same thought and was giving you room to arrive there alongside her rather than ahead of her. Clara thought about her grandfather Emil at 23 in a photograph from 1927, his cap pushed back, his arms crossed over his chest, standing in front of the main doors of the Harwick Brewing Company with the name carved in the arch behind him. She thought about Emil saying, "Left in 32. The work was done." What kind of work is done in a brewery cellar in 1931, she said. In the year before the estate that everyone expected to be large comes out much smaller than anyone familiar with August's affairs anticipated. What kind of work gets completed in 1932, the same year August dies? V set her coffee cup down deliberately and did not look away from her. "Clara, I know how it sounds." "Yes. How solid is that wall?" Clara thought about pressing her palm flat against the cold limestone for the 6th time and feeling nothing but cold, dry stone and the full weight of 62 steps of cellar behind her. "Very solid," she said. "But a solid wall is not the same as an original wall. They sat with that for a moment while the diner moved around them in the ordinary way of a diner on a Monday afternoon. The coffee machine running, a waitress making her circuit, two older men at the corner table discussing the weather coming down off the ridge at the end of the week. "There is one more thing," V said. "I found a notice in the Kellerton Courier from August of 1931, an announcement that the Harwick Brewing Company had completed an extensive renovation and expansion of its storage facilities." The notice was 4 sentences. It listed no contractor and no permits, which was not unusual for that period. It mentioned specifically that additional cold storage had been added to the lower level. "Additional cold storage," Clara said. "Added to the lower level," V said. August of 1931. 14 months before August Harwick died, and his estate settled out at considerably less than anyone familiar with his affairs had anticipated. The two men at the corner table kept talking about the weather. The coffee machine ran. The waitress made her circuit. And Clara sat in a diner booth on a Monday afternoon in October with cold coffee in front of her and V's steady eyes across the table. And she held these pieces together in her mind the way you hold pieces of something you are not yet certain is a pattern and wait to see whether they stay where you put them or shift into something else. They stayed. She drove home in the early dark. She made a bowl of soup she ate without tasting. She sat at the kitchen table with Emil's old photograph album open to the page she had been returning to for a week, a photograph from 1927. A group of men standing in front of the Harwick Brewing Company's main doors, their faces turned toward the camera with the serious expressions of men who do not entirely trust the technology but are willing to participate for the record. Emil was in the third row, second from the left, 23 years old, his cap pushed back on his head, his arms crossed over his chest. The building rose behind the assembled workers, the brick and the limestone and the carved name visible in the arch above the main doors. The same doors she had opened with the third key on the ring. Left in 32, he had said. The work was done. She had been 7 years old and coloring at the kitchen table, and the work of an old Slovak immigrant at a closed brewery in 1932 had not seemed like a thread worth pulling. She had gone back to her coloring. She had not asked. She looked at his face in the photograph for a long time. She looked at the building behind him, and she thought about the 14 steps going down, and the 62 steps across the packed earth floor, and the limestone wall at the far end that was not quite the same limestone as the walls beside it, with mortar that was not quite the same age as the mortar elsewhere. She closed the album. She wrote on the notepad by the phone, measuring tape, longer charging cable, backup battery, chalk. She put the ring of keys on the nightstand beside the notepad. She lay in the dark in the bedroom that still held the arrangement Frank had always preferred, the lamp on the right side of the bed, the particular stack of books on the left nightstand that she had not reorganized because the arrangement was still his in some way she was not ready to change. Outside, the silver maple dropped its last leaves against the window in the intermittent wind that came down off the ridge after dark. Inside, the house breathed around her in the quiet way of a house that has held a person long enough to know her sleeping rhythms. She did not sleep. She lay thinking about a wall at the end of a cellar that was longer than the building above it. She lay thinking about an estate that took 4 years to settle and came out smaller than anyone who had known August Harwick had expected. She lay thinking about her grandfather at 23 doing work that was done in 1932, the same year the man who built the building died. She thought about Frank in the parking lot. She thought, in the morning I will go back. I will bring a measuring tape and chalk and enough battery to stay as long as I need to stay. I will measure the cellar against the building above it. I will put my hand on that wall again, and this time I will have a better idea of what I am feeling for. Something has been waiting in that building for a very long time, she thought. It has been waiting with the patience of something that knows it will eventually be found by the right person. She did not know yet whether she was that person. She suspected she was. People who are not the right person do not usually think to bring chalk. She went back Tuesday morning with a measuring tape, a stick of yellow chalk, a backup battery pack, and the good rechargeable flashlight, plus a second one as a spare. She went back early, before 7, before the traffic on Mill Street picked up, and before anyone was likely to be watching a woman in a barn coat let herself into an old brewery with a ring of iron keys. The morning was colder than Monday had been. The ridge above town was hidden inside a low gray ceiling of cloud that had come in overnight, and the gravel lot beside the Harwick Brewing Company was damp from a rain that had stopped sometime before dawn and left everything with the dark polished look of a city scene through clean glass. She sat in the car for a moment with both hands on the steering wheel, and then she got out and unlocked the main doors and went in. She started from the outside. She unrolled the measuring tape along the exterior of the building on the north side, the side that faced away from Mill Street, and ran along the narrow side yard between the brewery and the chain-link fence at the property boundary. She measured the total exterior length of the building from the corner where the loading dock attached to the corner where the building ended at the back of the lot. 122 feet. She wrote it on her notepad in the careful way she had always written figures she wanted to be certain of, pressing the pencil down firmly so the numbers were clear. Then she went inside and down the 14 steps and into the cellar. She measured the cellar in 3 passes. First with the tape anchored at the base of the staircase wall, running the tape straight down the center of the space toward the far wall, pulling it taut at each 25-foot interval and marking the position on the floor with a stick of yellow chalk. The chalk marks showed her, very plainly, what she had suspected. At 122 feet, the point directly below the exterior building wall, she made a circle with the chalk. The far wall was another 31 feet ahead of her. She stood with the measuring tape in her hand in the cold of the cellar and looked at the chalk circle on the packed earth floor and then at the far wall. 31 feet of cellar existed beyond the footprint of the building above it. She walked the remaining 31 feet. The shelving along the walls continued for another 12 feet past the chalk circle and then stopped, the last pair of brackets empty. The pine shelf warped upward at its end, as if it had finally, after decades, given up pretending it had a purpose. Beyond the last shelf, the side walls of the cellar were bare limestone. The packed earth floor was unchanged. The ceiling arched over her in the same low vault. Nothing about. These last 31 feet looked different from the rest of the cellar except for the far wall at their end. She stood in front of the far wall again. She took her second flashlight out of her coat pocket and held both lights on the wall at once, one high and one low, the 2 beams crossing at the center of the stone face. The texture of the mortar in the joints was what held her attention the longest. Along the side walls and the near wall, the mortar had gone dark and grainy with age, the surface roughened by a century of the cellar's particular climate, the differential heating and cooling of limestone through Pennsylvania's seasons. The mortar in the far wall's joints was smoother and a shade lighter, the surface not rough, but almost creamy, the way mortar looks when it is old, but not as old as what surrounds it. She began at the lower left corner. She pressed each block systematically, beginning at knee height and working across the face of the wall in horizontal rows, pressing her palm flat against the center of each stone and then moving right. The stones were cold and completely solid under her hands, each one as immovable as the ground beneath her feet. She worked her way across the first row and up to the second, and across the second, and up to the third, her back beginning to ache from the position. It was on the 4th row, 3 stones in from the left wall and 1 stone to the right of center, that she noticed something different. Not a movement, not a sound. The difference was in the surface of the stone itself, a subtlety she might have missed if she had not been pressing every block with the same careful attention and comparing them by feel. The stone at that position was smoother than its neighbors, not worn smooth by foot traffic or contact, the way a floor stone goes smooth, but smooth in the way of stone that has been finished by a hand tool specifically, dressed to a flatter face than the rough quarried blocks on either side of it. She pressed it again and held the pressure. Nothing. She tried the block directly below it, also dressed smooth. She pressed both simultaneously, one with each palm, leaning her weight into the wall. A sound came from inside the wall, low and slow, the sound of something heavy moving on a pivot, the groan of a mechanism that has not been asked to work in a very long time and is deciding whether it will. She stepped back. The section of wall in front of her moved. It did not swing open dramatically. It rotated, slowly and with enormous deliberate weight, on a vertical axis at its center, the way a revolving door moves, but without any of the ease of a revolving door, with instead the slow, certain authority of something built from stone and iron, and the particular engineering confidence of a man who expected his work to outlast him by 100 years. The section was perhaps 5 feet wide and reached from 2 feet above the floor to within a foot of the ceiling arch, and it rotated inward on its center axis until it had turned 45 degrees and stopped, leaving an opening on each side. Two dark gaps in the face of the wall, each roughly 2.5 feet wide. She stood looking at the openings. Her flashlight showed her the edge of the gap on the near side. The back face of the rotating section, rough limestone, and beyond it a darkness that the flashlight beam entered and kept going into without finding a near wall. She thought about the number of people who had walked past this wall. Every worker who had ever brought a barrel down those stairs and rolled it along this packed earth floor and shelved it in the outer cellar and gone back up. Every brewmaster and foreman and deliverman across 34 years of operation after the vault was sealed. The county building inspector who had presumably visited the building at some point during those decades and walked these same 14 steps and stood in this same cellar and seen a wall. Nobody had pressed those two stones. Or if they had pressed them, they had not pressed them together simultaneously with enough force. The mechanism required both blocks at once. A person pressing one idly against the wall while walking past would feel nothing. You had to know to look for two, and you had to know to press them at the same time, and you had to know to lean your weight into it. August Harwick had trusted that the right person would figure out the two-block mechanism. She did not know whether that was confidence or hope or some combination of the two that felt different from the inside than it looked from the outside. But she understood the principle. She had spent 35 years teaching young people to read for what a text did not say directly, to look for the thing underneath the surface that the surface pointed toward but did not name. August Harwick had built a surface that pointed. She had followed where it pointed. She took one step forward. She put her flashlight through the left-hand gap and let the beam sweep the space inside. The first thing she saw was the barrels. They were arranged on low wooden racks that ran the full length of the vault on both sides. The racks built of heavy timber mortised and pegged together without nails, the kind of joinery that does not loosen with age. The barrels sat in their cradles at a slight angle, their bungs uppermost, each one sealed with wax that had gone the color of old honey. They were full. She could see from the way they sat in their cradles, the way they compressed the timber beneath them, that they were full. She counted the ones she could see in the left-hand wall rack, 11. She moved the beam to the right wall, 9 more visible from where she stood. Beyond the barrel racks, the vault went on. Against the far wall, shelving ran floor to near ceiling, and on the shelves, wrapped in what had once been cloth and was now mostly of fine gray textile ash that had taken the shape of whatever it covered and clung to it, rows of bottles sat in their original positions. They had not been disturbed. Wherever the cloth wrapping had held, the bottles below it were intact, their wax-sealed corks still in place, their glass dark with age but whole. In the center of the vault floor, wooden crates were stacked 2 and 3 deep, most of them still upright. Some collapsed along their edges, but their contents apparently still contained by the collapsed boards. The crates were stenciled on their ends with writing she could not yet read from where she stood. And at the far end of the vault, bolted to the floor against the back wall, sat a safe. It was not a dramatic safe, not the kind you see in old films, round-doored and ornate. It was a heavy rectangular iron box, approximately 3 feet tall and 2 feet wide and 2 feet deep. Its surface matte black with the slightly rough texture of cast iron. Its door fitted with a combination dial and a lever handle. The kind of safe a careful man of business would have bought in the 1920s from a reputable manufacturer and bolted to the floor of the most secure space he owned. She stood in the gap between the two sections of the rotating wall, and she held both flashlights into the vault, and she looked. She had been an English teacher for 35 years. She understood the uses of language and its limits. She did not have language for what she was looking at, and she understood in the cold of that cellar that this was one of those moments in a life when language is not what is needed and not what is useful and not what will be remembered. What she would remember was the smell. The sweetness she had noticed in the outer cellar deepened and concentrated and specific now. The warm, complicated breath of aged spirits in oak, the particular language of a thing that has been taking its time in the dark for a very long time and is not done yet. She would remember the barrels sitting in their cradles as if they were sleeping. She would remember thinking about Frank. Every inch of it was thought about. Yes, she said to the empty vault, to her husband who was not there to see it, to the building that had held this for 90 years and was now holding her flashlight beams and her reflection in the dark bottles on the shelves. Yes, it was. She did not go all the way in that morning. She understood, standing on the threshold, that she needed to bring someone else here before she touched anything, before she let her own presence disturb any more of the air in that space than she already had. She needed a witness. She needed someone who would understand what she was looking at with the same care she wanted to bring to it herself. She went back up the 14 steps and across the fermentation room and out through the main entrance into the cold gray morning, and she sat in her car in the gravel lot, and she called V. V picked up on the second ring. "I found it," Clara said. A pause. "Found what exactly?" V said. And then, "Never mind. I'm coming." She came in 22 minutes, which meant she had been ready to come before the call. She parked beside Clara's car and got out in her plum-colored coat and her driving gloves, and she looked at Clara sitting in the driver's seat with the car, door open and both feet on the gravel, and she said, "You're the color of someone who has just heard something they weren't entirely prepared for." "I'm the color of someone who's been in a cold cellar for 2 hours, Clara said. "Come inside." She walked V through the main floor and down the fermentation room, and through the heavy oak door and down the 14 steps. She did not say anything on the way down. She let the cellar speak for itself. She walked her across the packed earth floor to the chalk circle she had drawn at the 122-foot mark, and she showed V the mark. She said, "The building above us ends here. The wall ahead is 31 feet further on." V looked at the chalk circle. She looked at the far wall with both flashlight beams on it. Then Clara walked her to the rotating section and showed her the 2 dress-smooth blocks, and showed her how, when you pressed them together, the mechanism moved. V pressed them. The section rotated again, slowly and with the same low groan of a thing working after long stillness, turning on its center pivot until the 2 gaps opened. V stood in the left-hand gap with her flashlight in the vault. She did not say anything for a full minute. Then she said, very quietly, in the voice she used when she was teaching something she considered genuinely important and wanted the room to know it. August Harwick built this room during Prohibition. He built it to hold everything he could not put in a bank and everything he could not let the federal government find. And then he died before he told anyone where it was. And nobody found it, Clara said, for 90 years. V turned and looked at her. Her eyes behind her glasses were very clear and very steady. "Clara," she said, "there is a man I want you to meet. He has been trying to write a chapter about the Harwick family for 12 years. He is going to need to sit down when he sees this room." His name was Harold Price. He had taught regional history at Bucknell University for 36 years and had retired 5 years earlier into a small house in Lewisburg with a research library he had been building since graduate school and a book about the industrial history of the Susquehanna Valley that he had been writing, or planning to write, or failing to write, since he submitted his last article to a journal in 2015. He was 72 years old, thin and white-haired, and wearing a corduroy jacket that had seen better decades, and he drove to Kellerton the next morning in a car that V described as heroic in its commitment to operating despite all available evidence suggesting it should not be. He walked into the cellar without speaking. Clara led him across the packed earth floor and showed him the 2 smooth blocks, and he put his own hands on them, and the mechanism rotated, and he stood in the gap for a long time with his flashlight going slowly around the vault, the beam moving from the barrel racks to the shelving to the crates to the iron safe at the back. He was quiet for so long that V, standing beside Clara at the outer cellar, said his name once, softly. He did not answer immediately. He was looking at the stenciling on the barrel faces. He moved his flashlight from one to the next, reading the faded ink on each barrel's face in sequence, moving left to right along the rack the way a librarian moves along a shelf of books, reading the spines. When he had read all the visible faces on the left rack, he moved the beam to the right rack and read those as well. Then he turned around. He turned to Clara, and his face had the expression of a man who has spent 12 years assembling a puzzle and has just been handed the piece that completes the center. "The work order," he said. "There is a work order in the county construction records from July of 1931. It is listed as an addition to the subgrade storage capacity of the Harwick Brewing Company, and it is listed as completed in September of 1931 by a private crew, no contractor of record. I found that document 3 years ago, and I have spent 3 years trying to understand what the addition was." He stepped back from the gap. "The work order lists 4 names," he said. August Harwick listed them as the foreman of the construction crew. They were all former employees of the brewery. He paid them each separately, in cash, according to a transaction record I found in the partial estate settlement. No paperwork about the nature of the work, just the names and the payments. Clara waited. He reached into the inside pocket of his corduroy jacket and took out a worn leather notebook he had carried, from the look of it, for many years. He opened it to a page near the back and read 4 names from the top of the page, reading them the way a careful researcher reads something he has verified thoroughly enough to trust completely. Otto Brower, Joseph Kern, Patrick Hanley, Emil Dunmore. The Cellar held the sound of those 4 names for a moment in the same way it held everything else, without comment, without emphasis, patiently. Clara did not say anything. She put one hand on the cold limestone wall beside the rotating section, and she breathed. Emil Dunmore had come to the Harwick Brewing Company in 1924. He had worked the dock and then the fermentation floor. He had stayed until 1932. He had said, in her kitchen, in her childhood, on a morning she had been coloring at the table, that he had left in 32 because the work was done. The work was this room. He had built it with his hands, with these walls, with the mechanism she had just pressed, and the vault she was standing at the threshold of. And he had sealed it, and walked away, and said the work was done, and never spoken of it to anyone in the remaining 40 years of his life. She had her grandfather's hands. People had told her this across her whole life. You have Emil's hands, her father had said once, the wide palms, the short fingers. She looked at her own hands now in the flashlight glow at the cellar wall. She had built nothing with them. She had taught for 35 years and graded 35 years of papers and explained the difference between a metaphor and a simile to approximately 3,000 students. And she had planted a garden every spring and canned tomatoes every August and sanded the porch railing twice and repaired 2 broken windows herself rather than call someone. She had not built a vault. She had not sealed a room and walked away from it and kept a silence for 40 years. But she had pressed 2 stones in a limestone wall in a cold cellar in October, and the door had opened, and she was here. And the room had been waiting for someone who would press those 2 stones, and it had waited 90 years, and she was the one. Emil, she thought. You built it. I found it. That seems right. She was crying. She had not known she was going to cry, and she did not try to stop it. Harold Price looked away at the vault with great attention, examining the ceiling with the absorbed interest of a man who has decided the ceiling requires his full focus for the next several minutes. V put one hand on Clara's shoulder and left it there and did not say anything, which was the correct thing and which only V would have known was the correct thing. After a while, Clara wiped her face on her coat sleeve and said, "The safe." They went in. The vault was cool and completely dry, the limestone walls maintaining the temperature and humidity that they had maintained for 90 years with the indifference of stone to anything as fleeting as a human concern about conditions. The barrels on the racks were deeply cold, the oak of their staves dense and hard under her gloved hand. She walked slowly along the left-hand rack, reading the stenciling on the barrel faces, rye whiskey, bottled in Bond 1919. The stencil ink had faded but was legible, each barrel face marked in the same careful hand, date and type, and what appeared to be a lot number she did not yet understand. The shelving along the back wall held the bottles in rows so deep she could not see the back of the shelf with her flashlight. Each bottle was individually wrapped in cloth that had collapsed over the decades into a soft gray skin over the bottle's shape, but the bottles below the cloth were intact. She picked one up, gently, and unwrapped it. A square bottle of dark brown glass, its wax seal intact, its label still adhered to the glass, a label printed in a font she associated with an earlier era of commercial printing, Old Kellerton Reserve. Established 1889. Bottled in Bond under the supervision of the United States government. The label was dated October of 1919, 1 month before Prohibition went into effect. She set the bottle back in its place very carefully. The iron safe at the back of the vault was smaller in person than it had looked from the threshold, or perhaps the room itself was larger than it had looked from the threshold, or perhaps she was simply still adjusting to being inside a space that had been sealed since 1931. She crouched in front of it and looked at the combination dial. The dial was clean, the numbers still legible. The lever handle was firm in its housing, not seized, not corroded. She did not try the combination. She did not know the combination. She called a locksmith. He came the next morning, a compact man named Barry who had been in the profession for 20 years and who, When he descended the cellar stairs and saw the rotating section of the vault door still open in the wall, stopped walking for one full second before continuing forward with the professional composure of a man who has decided that the correct response to extraordinary things is to proceed methodically. He worked on the safe for 40 minutes. Clara sat on an overturned wooden crate and watched him and did not disturb him, and he did not speak except once, briefly, to ask her to hold his flashlight at a specific angle while he listened to the dial. The safe opened on the 41st minute. Inside were three things. The first was a set of velvet-lined trays, 4 of them, stacked one atop the other, each tray holding coins in individual cutout compartments. The coins were gold, American double eagles, $20 gold pieces, their surfaces still bright in the flashlight beam in a way that gold retains when it has been kept in stable conditions for a very long time. She counted the trays and the compartments without touching them. 214 coins. The second was a leather document case, flat and square, its clasp still closed. Inside the case were papers in a bundle, a mixture of folded letters and handwritten pages. The third was an envelope, unsealed, with a single word written on its face in a large, confident hand that had belonged to someone who was accustomed to being understood: family. She took the envelope out of the safe and held it in both hands. The paper was heavy bond paper, the kind a man of business in the 1920s would have kept for correspondence he considered permanent. She opened it. The letter inside was 2 pages, both sides, written in the same large, confident script as the word on the envelope, the pen strokes of a man who had made up his mind before he sat down and was writing not to discover what he thought, but to record what he had already decided. The handwriting was German-influenced, the capitals elaborate, the lowercase letters disciplined. The ink was brown with age, but every word was legible. She read it standing in the vault with both flashlights on the page and Harold Price, and V standing just inside the door at a respectful distance. August Harwick had written the letter in August of 1932, 1 month before he died. He had addressed it to his son William and to William's children and to their children after them. And the opening line, translated from a German that occasionally surfaced in his phrasing, was, "If you are reading this, you have done the difficult thing. You have been patient enough and trusting enough to look for what I was not able to tell you directly. I am sorry I could not tell you directly." He explained the vault. He explained that he had begun converting the brewery's surplus profits into tangible assets in 1923, the 3rd year of Prohibition, when it became clear to him that the government's prohibition on alcohol was not going to be brief, and that a man who had built his livelihood on fermented grain had better develop a second strategy for the long term. He had not stopped brewing, he wrote, because he was not a man who stopped doing the thing he knew how to do well simply because the government asked him to. He had instead become very careful about what he did with the proceeds. He had purchased gold in the form of both bullion and coin through channels he declined to identify. He had laid in his pre-prohibition stocks in their full extent, every cask he had on hand in October of 1919, sealed and stored. He had acquired certain artworks and objects from European dealers over the course of the 20s, pieces he believed would hold their value across whatever disruptions were coming. And he believed considerable disruptions were coming because he had lived through enough of history to know that certainty about the future was a luxury the present could never afford. He had built the vault in the summer and fall of 1931 with the help of 4 men he trusted completely, men who had been with him since the brewery's early years and who he believed had the discretion and the loyalty to keep silent about what they had helped him build. He had paid them generously and he had asked them to say nothing, and he believed they had honored that request, and he was grateful. He listed their names: Otto Brauer, Joseph Kern, Patrick Hanley, Emil Dunmore. He was sorry, the letter continued, that he had not been able to bring William into his confidence directly. He had intended to. He had been waiting until the political climate was less uncertain, until he was more certain of what he was going to leave William to navigate without him. He had waited too long. The cancer that had taken his wife 10 years earlier had now taken him as well, and the vault would need to wait for William to find it without his father's guidance. The gold bullion in a separate wooden chest he had placed against the left wall under the lowest shelf, which Clara had not yet found. She found it the next morning. It was exactly where the letter said it would be, pushed back against the limestone wall beneath the lowest shelf of the left rack, invisible from the entry gap because the barrel rack obscured it from That angle. The chest was made of hardwood, oak or walnut, its exterior plain and without ornamentation, its joints pegged rather than nailed. It was approximately 4 feet long and 2 feet wide and 2 feet deep, and it was heavy enough that she could not move it more than a few inches even with both hands. Inside, visible when she opened the unlocked lid, the bars were stacked in rows on a bed of sawdust that had compressed to a hard layer over 9 decades. Each bar approximately the length of her forearm and the width of her palm. Their surfaces the dull, unmistakable yellow of gold that has not been touched by air in a long time. She counted the rows. She counted the bars in each row. She sat back on her heels on the packed earth floor of the vault and put her hands on her knees and breathed. He had written the combination to the safe. 3 numbers, a turn left, a turn right, a turn left. He wrote a description of the vault's contents as he understood them. The casks of rye, bourbon, scotch, cognac, and Irish whiskey. The bottled spirits. The crates, which contained artworks he had acquired from a dealer in Philadelphia, wrapped and crated for storage. The gold bullion in a separate wooden chest he had placed against the left wall under the lowest shelf, which Clara had not yet found. He ended the letter simply. He did not apologize again. He wrote that everything in the vault was for his family and that he had built it for them and sealed it for them, and that the only thing he regretted was the secrecy, which had seemed necessary at the time and which he now understood had been a lonely way to carry a thing, and that he hoped whoever read this letter would understand that loneliness is not the same as shame, and that he had not been ashamed of a single thing he had made in his life. He had signed it, Your grandfather. August Joseph Harwick. August 1932. Clara folded the letter along its original creases. She thought about William Harwick selling the building in 1947, 15 years after his father's death, never having found what his father had built in the cellar. She thought about the subsequent owners running the brewery for another 34 years, walking past the far wall of the cellar every working day of those years. She thought about the person who had written "Tell the kettle I'm sorry" in the last ledger entry in February of 1981, locking up for the final time, the vault sealed behind a wall 31 feet beyond the back of the building, undetected and undisturbed. She thought about the county assessor writing $300 on a printed sheet and putting the building up for auction, and a retired teacher in Kellerton raising her hand. She looked at the letter in her own hands, at the name Emil Dunmore in August Harwick's German-influenced script, and she thought about a young Slovak man of 23 working the dock and the fermentation floor, and then spending a summer and fall building a room in the earth beneath a building on Mill Street in Kellerton, Pennsylvania, working with his hands the way he had always worked, carefully and without waste, and then walking away from that room and saying nothing about it for 40 years and going to his grave with it still sealed exactly as he had left it. She did not know whether Emil had guessed that the room would never be found by the family it was built for. She did not know whether he had ever, across those 40 years, thought about the vault and wondered. She knew only that whatever he had thought about it, he had kept his word, and the keeping of that word had lasted longer than his life. Her grandfather had put something into the earth under this building. She had pulled it back out. She told Patricia that evening. She sat at her kitchen table with the phone in her hand for a long time before she called, thinking about how to begin and not finding a beginning that seemed adequate. Then she stopped looking for one and dialed. Patricia picked up on the third ring. Clara told her about the vault. She told her about the 2 smooth blocks and the rotating section of wall and the barrels in their racks and the bottles on the shelves. She told her about the iron safe and the combination and the letter from August Harwick dated August of 1932. She told her about the list of 4 names and the one of them that was Emil Dunmore. When she had finished, the phone was quiet for long enough that she said, "Patricia." "I'm here," Patricia said. Her voice was different from any version of her daughter's voice Clara could immediately catalog. "Mom, how much is in there?" "I don't know yet. I'm going to bring in people who know how to answer that." Patricia was quiet again for a moment. "I'm coming up Saturday," she said. "I'm not asking. I'm telling you. I'm coming up Saturday, and I'm going to bring Glenn, and you are going to show us the room." "All right," Clara said. "Saturday." "Mom." "Yes. You okay?" Clara looked out the kitchen window at the dark back garden and the wooden fence and the neighbor's silver maple, which had finished dropping its leaves entirely now and was standing bare against the dark October sky, the shape of it clean and simple and without ornamentation. "I'm fine," she said. Then she thought about what she had been telling herself for 4 years, and she said, "More than fine, actually. I think I'm more than fine." She called the people. It took her 3 days to find the right ones. 3 days of careful reading and phone calls, and one conversation with Harold Price that lasted 2 hours and produced a list of 6 specialists she should contact in a specific order. She did not call them all at once. She started with the one whose particular expertise was most directly relevant to the most significant portion of what the vault contained. Marguerite Blum flew in from New York on a Friday afternoon. She was a senior specialist in rare and aged spirits at one of the major auction houses, a woman in her early 50s who had spent 25 years building an expertise in pre-Prohibition American spirits, and who had been quoted in a Wall Street Journal article about the rare spirits market that Clara had found online and read 3 times. She arrived in Kellerton in a rental car with a rolling case of assessment equipment and a colleague named Thomas who carried a separate case and said very little. Clara took them down to the cellar on Friday evening. Marguerite Blum stopped at the base of the cellar stairs and stood still. She put her hand over her nose and mouth, not in distaste, but in the focused way of someone trying to isolate a specific piece of sensory information from everything around it. She breathed in very slowly through her nose. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, without turning around, in a voice that had gone very level and very controlled, "How many barrels?" 31 intact, Clara said. "As far as I've been able to count." Marguerite walked the rest of the way to the rotating section without speaking and stood in the gap, and then stepped into the vault and went directly to the nearest barrel on the left rack. She ran her hand along the stave face. She found the bung and pressed it gently with her thumb. She examined the wax seal on the bung hole. She took a small tool from the rolling case Thomas had opened beside her, and she carefully, with the delicacy of someone who understands exactly what they are handling, broke the wax seal on the bung of the nearest barrel only enough to extract a single small sample with a glass dropper. She held the dropper up to the flashlight and looked at the liquid inside it with the same focused attention she had given to the smell at the base of the stairs. Clara watched her. V was at the vault entry. Harold Price had a notebook open on a crate. "Can I ask you a question?" Clara said. "You want to know what this is worth?" Marguerite said. She was still looking at the dropper. "I want to know what it is," Clara said. "I'll get to the other part." Marguerite turned. She looked at Clara with the expression of a professional who has spent 2 decades being surprised by the objects she encounters and has become almost, but not entirely immune to the experience. "This is a 1919 American rye whiskey," she said, "bottled in bond, which means it was produced at a single distillery in a single season under federal supervision and aged a minimum of 4 years. The cask has been sitting in a stable, cool environment for 104 years with an intact seal. The spirit inside it is at an age and in a condition that has, to my knowledge, no parallel in the North American spirits market. There is no other whiskey like this in existence anywhere. These 31 casks, if they are what the stenciling says they are, represent a collection that is without precedent." Clara let that sit for a moment. "How without precedent?" she said. Marguerite put the dropper back in the case. She looked at the barrel rack. She looked at the shelving with its cloth-wrapped bottles. She looked at the crates with their stenciled ends. "The casks alone," she said, speaking carefully, in the preliminary way of someone who wants to be understood as giving a working estimate and not a final appraisal, based on comparable sales in the aged whiskey market in the last 3 years and accounting for the unique provenance and condition of this collection. "The casks alone are likely to appraise in the range of $150 to $200 million. The vault was very quiet. Harold Price's pen stopped moving on his notebook page. V, from the doorway, said nothing at all. Clara stood in the cool vault with the smell of 90 years of patient aging around her and said, "That's just the casks." "That is just the casks," Marguerite said. "The bottled spirits will require individual assessment. Each bottle will need to be identified and authenticated and the condition evaluated. But based on what I'm seeing on these shelves, I would expect the bottled collection to appraise in the range of $80 to $120 million. She looked at Clara directly. "I have assessed rare spirits collections for 25 years, she said. "I want to be very clear with you that I am telling you what I believe the market evidence supports and not what I think you want to hear. The collection you are standing in is the most significant discovery in the history of the pre-prohibition spirits market. There is no other way for me to characterize it. Gerald Fitch came the following week. He was a gold and rare coin appraiser from Philadelphia, a short and very precise man of 64 who had been in the business since before Clara's retirement and who approached the wooden chest under the lowest shelf of the left wall with the same methodical calm he apparently brought to everything. He spent an afternoon with the chest open on the cellar floor, assessing the gold bullion bars it contained by weight and purity, and he spent a separate afternoon with the velvet trays of gold coins from the safe, a loop in his eye, turning each coin in gloved fingers with the practiced economy of long practice. He came upstairs at the end of the second day and sat at the folding table Clara had set up in the former fermentation room and wrote 3 lines on a piece of paper and slid it across the table to her. The bullion, $112 million, current market, subject to full assay. The gold coin collection, $38 million, preliminary, subject to full numismatic assessment, with 2 specimens in the collection that may independently appraise significantly higher and require separate evaluation. The coins alone, he said, would make this one of the most significant private coin collections to come to market in the last decade. The Double Eagle series you have is complete from 1900 through 1932 with no gaps and multiple specimens in mint state. A complete series of that depth and condition has not been seen at auction in my professional memory. She had brought the art appraisers in by then as well, a pair of specialists from a firm in Pittsburgh who had spent 3 days unpacking and examining the contents of the wooden crates. 2 of the paintings inside the crates were identified as works by early 20th century American painters of established reputation. One of them a canvas that had been listed as a lost work in the catalogue raisonné for that artist since the 1940s. The rest of the crated works were a mix of European prints and drawings, bronze figures, and decorative objects, all assessed to be of significant collector value. The artwork, $41 million, preliminary. Clara sat with all of the preliminary assessments spread across her kitchen table on a Wednesday evening in November, the numbers written in the careful hand of each appraiser on each separate sheet of paper. She had a yellow legal pad beside her on which she had been doing the addition and checking it, and doing it again, the way she used to check her arithmetic before she trusted a number to be permanent. The spirits, between $230 and $320 million, depending on the final auction results. The gold and coins, $150 million. The artwork and other items, $41 million. The total, at the midpoint of the spirits range, was $471 million. She wrote that number on the legal pad. She looked at it. She had paid $300 for the building. She had paid $300, and she was sitting at her kitchen table with a yellow legal pad that had $471 million written on it in her own handwriting. And the silver maple outside the window had been bare for a month now, and the November rain was coming against the glass, and the radiator under the kitchen window was ticking as the heat came on. She thought about Patricia's voice on the phone. "Mom, how much is in there?" She thought about Frank in the parking lot in 2017 saying every inch of it was thought about. She thought about Emil in the cellar in 1931, his wide hands on the limestone, fitting stone into stone in the cold underground of a building on Mill Street in a county he had come to from Slovakia when he was 20 years old and had decided, without making a decision about it in any formal sense, to stay. He had built something to last. He had left it in the ground. He had said the work was done and walked away from it and let it be. And it had been, for 90 years, waiting to be what he had made it. She picked up the phone and called Patricia. Her daughter answered before the second ring. "Saturday," Clara said. "Come Saturday. And tell Glenn to come too." "Is it what you thought?" Patricia said. Her voice was careful and steady in the way it always was when she was trying to be calm about something. Clara looked at the legal pad. "It's more," she said. "It's considerably more." Silence on the other end of the line. Then Patricia's voice, smaller and more genuinely herself than the careful and steady version. "Mom." "I know," Clara said. "I know, honey. How are you holding it? How are you okay right now?" Clara looked out the window at the rain on the glass and the bare silver maple and thought about the vault in the cellar of the Harwick Brewing Company, sealed and patient, the barrels in their racks, the bottles on their shelves, the letter from August Harwick dated August of 1932 addressed to a family that had never come back to read it. "I'm okay," she said. "I'm very okay. I've been standing in a room that someone built for whoever was going to find it. and whoever turned out to be me, and I have been thinking about all the ways a person can leave something in the world and trust it to be found at the right time by the right person. Your grandfather built that room, Patricia said. Part of it, Clara said. He built the walls. I found them. I think that's how it was meant to go. She poured the last of the evening's coffee into a cup, and she sat at the kitchen table with the preliminary assessments in front of her and the legal pad with the number written on it, and she let herself be quietly and completely astonished, which seemed to her the only appropriate response available for the full length of the November rain against the window. Somewhere on Mill Street, the Harwick Brewing Company sat in the dark with its limestone foundation and its cast iron window frames and its copper kettles and its cellar and its vault, which was no longer sealed, which had been open for 3 weeks now, and which she locked each evening when she left and unlocked each morning when she returned. The vault that smelled of 90 years of patience and grain and oak and the particular sweetness of something that has been kept exactly as it was meant to be kept for exactly as long as it was meant to be kept. $471 million. August Harwick had written, the only thing he regretted was the secrecy, which had seemed necessary at the time and which he now understood had been a lonely way to carry a thing. She understood that. She had been carrying her own weight alone for 4 years. She knew what a lonely thing felt like from the inside, the specific gravity of it, the way it stayed in you when you lay down at night. She was not going to be alone with this. She set the legal pad aside. She picked up the phone again and she called V, and this time it was past 10 in the evening and V answered anyway, because V always answered, which was one of the things about 31 years of friendship that did not get enough credit in any accounting of a life. Come for dinner tomorrow, Clara said. I have a number to show you, and I want to show it to someone in person, and I want that person to be you. I will be there at 6, V said. What should I bring? Bring the bottle of port you've been saving, Clara said. The one you bought in Lisbon. A pause. Clara, V said. That is a 40-year-old port. I know it is, Clara said. I think the occasion is exactly right. Patricia and Glenn arrived on Saturday morning in Glenn's car, which was a sensible gray sedan that Glenn drove with the careful attention he brought to everything, both hands on the wheel, appropriate following distance. Clara watched them pull into the gravel lot beside the brewery from where she was standing at the main entrance with the keys already in her hand and the heavy wooden doors propped open behind her. Patricia got out of the car and looked at the building. She stood for a moment in the cold November morning with her hands in her coat pockets, her eyes going from the limestone foundation to the cast iron window frames to the carved name above the arch. Then she looked at her mother. I see it, Patricia said. I see what Dad saw. Yes, Clara said. Come inside. She walked them through the main floor first, the way she had been walked through it by her own attention and her own flashlight 6 weeks earlier, the copper kettles and the oak planking and the high ceiling on its cast iron columns. She watched Glenn's face move through several successive expressions that he was working to keep professional and failing at in a way she found genuinely touching. He was not a man who spent his days in rooms like this. He was a man who spent his days in conference rooms and on spreadsheets, and what he was looking at now had nothing in common with any of that, and he was clearly not sure where in himself to put it. The fermentation room. The supervisor's corkboard with its 1979 production schedules. The staircase to the upper offices and the green ledgers on the shelf, and the last entry in the last ledger, and tell the kettle I'm sorry, which Patricia read twice over Clara's shoulder and did not say anything about for a long moment. Then the heavy oak door, and the 14 steps, and the cellar. Clara had left the vault section rotated open. The gap in the wall was visible from 30 feet away, a dark slot in the pale limestone face. And when Patricia's flashlight found it, she stopped walking and did not say anything and did not move forward. Clara came and stood beside her. That is a door, Patricia said. It was built in 1931, Clara said, by August Harwick and 4 men he trusted, one of whom was Emil Dunmore. Patricia turned to look at her mother. In the flashlight glow and the cold of the cellar, her face was doing several things at once. Grandpa built that, she said. He built the walls, Clara said. I found them. I think that was how it was always meant to go. They stood in the vault for a long time. Clara did not rush them. She had learned in 6 weeks of coming here every morning that the vault asked to be stood in and looked at, and that the looking took time, and that the time was not wasted. She watched Patricia move slowly along the left barrel rack, reading the stenciling on each face, her gloved fingertips not quite touching the wood. She watched Glenn go to the shelving at the far wall and crouch down to look at the collapsed lower shelf where the cloth wrapping of the bottles had given way and the bottles below were visible, their dark glass and their wax-sealed corks, and their labels still adhered after 104 years in this air. She watched him pick up a bottle, gently, and turn it to read the label. He set it back in its place with the deliberate care of a man who has just understood something significant about the nature of the object in his hands. Clara walked them to the wooden chest under the lowest shelf. She lifted the lid. They looked at the sawdust that had spent 9 decades compressing under the weight of the gold bars, which were gone now, removed and assessed and accounted for, but the impression of them remained in the sawdust the way a weight leaves an impression in soft material. Specific, unmistakable. Glenn crouched in front of the open chest and looked at the impression for a long moment. He was a man whose professional life was built on understanding where value resided and in what form it traveled and how it was accounted for. And he was looking at sawdust, and what was in his face was something that none of his professional training had prepared him for. Then she gave Patricia August's letter. Patricia read it standing at the back of the vault near the iron safe, her flashlight held above the pages at an angle that kept the light on the paper without casting her own shadow across it. She read both pages. She read them slowly, and Clara watched her eyes move down the lines with the focused attention that Patricia had always given to things she was reading for the first time and expected to be held accountable to later. When she got to the list of 4 names, she stopped. She read the line again. Then she folded the letter very carefully along its original creases, the way you fold something you have just been trusted with, and she held it in both hands for a moment before she gave it back. He wrote it 1 month before he died, Clara said. I know, Patricia said. I can see that. I can see it in the handwriting at the end, the way it tires. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, he never got to tell anyone this was here. No. He built it for his family, and then he died before he could tell his family where it was. Yes. Patricia looked at the vault around them. The barrels. The bottles. The crates. The iron safe standing open and empty on the floor of the room. And Emil kept the secret for 40 years, she said. He did. She looked at her mother. There was a thing in Patricia's face that Clara had not seen there in a long time, perhaps not since Patricia was very young, a kind of openness that the years of careful professional competence had not taken away but had covered over, and which was now, in this cold underground room, surfacing. You knew something was in here, Patricia said, before you bid on it. You didn't know what, but you knew something. Clara considered that honestly. I knew the building was worth looking at, she said. Frank had been saying so for years. And I knew it was about to be permanently lost if no one bought it. And there was something in the way Emil talked about leaving in 32 that I had not forgotten even though I was 7 years old when he said it. You remembered that from when you were 7. I remembered it because it sounded finished, Clara said. The work was done. I had never heard him talk about anything that way. Everything he ever finished, he talked about the next thing. This was the only time he said the work was done and left it alone. Patricia was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, in a voice that was as direct and undefended as any voice she had ever used with her mother, I should not have told you not to bid on it. No, Clara said. I was scared for you. I was treating you like someone who needed to be protected from herself, and I have been treating you that way for 4 years, and I am sorry. I know why you did it, Clara said. I'm not angry. I know you're not. That's almost worse. Clara looked at her daughter in the vault of the Harwick Brewing Company and thought about all the things a mother and a daughter can carry between them across 4 years of grief, the weight distributed unevenly and the distribution never quite discussed. She thought about Patricia driving up from Harrisburg to sit in the 3rd row of folding chairs at a county auction and putting her hand on her mother's arm. You came, Clara said, that morning at the courthouse. I called you the night before, and you drove up. You didn't have to do that. Of course I drove up, Patricia said. That was not nothing, Patricia. That was not a small thing. Don't let the vault make you forget that the driving up was the important part. Patricia pressed her lips together. She looked at the floor of the vault and then back at her mother. Glenn appeared beside them. He had been standing at a respectful distance, his own flashlight now pointed at the floor, giving them the room required. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, with the particular directness of a man whose professional vocabulary has failed him and who has defaulted to something older and truer underneath it, Clara, I owe you an apology. I recommended a structural engineer like this building was a liability problem to be managed. I should have listened to what you actually said about why you wanted it. I'm sorry. You were being practical, Clara said. That's what I needed from you at the time. It was not what you needed. It was what I had, she said, and smiled at him. And now we're here, and the structural assessment would have been very positive, so it all worked out. Glenn looked around the vault and said, mostly to himself, in the low voice of a man doing arithmetic, 471 million. At the midpoint of the spirit's estimate, Clara said. Glenn looked at her. He blinked once. He said, you paid $300. And fees, Clara said. 450 all in. The three of them stood in August Harwick's vault in the cold November morning and breathed the same air that the spirits in the barrels had been breathing for 104 years, and nobody said anything for a while. And the saying nothing was the correct and complete response. The question of legal ownership was settled by Kellerton's county recorder's office and a brief conversation with an attorney named Edith Graff, who specialized in property law and who had handled enough estate and acquisition cases to be unsurprised by unusual circumstances, though she acknowledged, after reviewing the deed and the vault's existence, that this was on the unusual end of her particular scale. The contents of the vault belonged to Clara. She owned the property, she owned the building on the property, and she owned everything in the building. The vault had been built as part of the building's cellar in 1931. It had not been disclosed at any subsequent sale of the property because, as Edith noted dryly, it had not been known to any subsequent seller. August Harwick's heirs had sold the building in 1947 without knowledge of the vault's existence and had received fair market value for the building as it was understood to be at that time. No claim of any kind survived that transaction. August Harwick had built it. Clara Dunmore had found it. It was hers. She went home that evening and sat at the kitchen table with that simple fact and held it for a while without doing anything with it. $471 million was hers. She said that to herself in the kitchen of the house on Maple Avenue where she had lived for 31 years and where a drafty window on the east side had been drafty since the winter before Frank's diagnosis, and which she had been meaning to have resealed for 4 years, and which was still drafty. She could have the window resealed. She understood the absurdity of thinking about the window in the context of what she was thinking about. She held on to it anyway, because the window was real and the number was still becoming real and the window was a place to start. Word moved through Kellerton the way things move through a town of 20,000, first as rumor, and then as confirmation, and then as a specific detail that people could hold in their hands. Harold Price had contacted the County Historical Society the week before, with Clara's knowledge and approval, to inform them of the vault's existence and historical significance. The Historical Society had contacted the Kellerton Courier. The Courier had run a story that was careful with the legal details and extensive with the historical ones, devoting a full inside page to the history of August Harwick and the Harwick Brewing Company and the construction in 1931 that the county building records had listed only as an addition to subgrade storage capacity. The story named the 4 men. It named Emil Dunmore. Clara read it at the building was worth looking at, she said. Frank had been saying so for years. And I knew it was about to be permanently lost if no one bought it. And there was something in the way Emil talked about leaving in 32 that I had not forgotten even though I was 7 years old when he said it. You remembered that from when you were 7. I remembered it because it sounded finished, Clara said. The work was done. I had never heard him talk about anything that way. Everything he ever finished, he talked about the next thing. This was the only time he said the work was done and left it alone. Patricia was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, in a voice that was as direct and undefended as any voice she had ever used with her mother, I should not have told you not to bid on it. No, Clara said. I was scared for you. I was treating you like someone who needed to be protected from herself, and I have been treating you that way for 4 years, and I am sorry. I know why you did it, Clara said. I'm not angry. I know you're not. That's almost worse. Clara looked at her daughter in the vault of the Harwick Brewing Company and thought about all the things a mother and a daughter can carry between them across 4 years of grief, the weight distributed unevenly and the distribution never quite discussed. She thought about Patricia driving up from Harrisburg to sit in the 3rd row of folding chairs at a county auction and putting her hand on her mother's arm. You came, Clara said, that morning at the courthouse. I called you the night before, and you drove up. You didn't have to do that. Of course I drove up, Patricia said. That was not nothing, Patricia. That was not a small thing. Don't let the vault make you forget that the driving up was the important part. Patricia pressed her lips together. She looked at the floor of the vault and then back at her mother. Glenn appeared beside them. He had been standing at a respectful distance. His own flashlight now pointed at the floor, giving them the room required. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, with the particular directness of a man whose professional vocabulary has failed him and who has defaulted to something older and truer underneath it, Clara, I owe you an apology. I recommended a structural engineer like this building was a liability problem to be managed. I should have listened to what you actually said about why you wanted it. I'm sorry. You were being practical, Clara said. That's what I needed from you at the time. It was not what you needed. It was what I had, she said, and smiled at him. And now we're here, and the structural assessment would have been very positive, so it all worked out. Glenn looked around the vault and said, mostly to himself, in the low voice of a man doing arithmetic, 471 million. At the midpoint of the spirit's estimate, Clara said. Glenn looked at her. He blinked once. He said, you paid $300. And fees, Clara said. 450 all in. The three of them stood in August Harwick's vault in the cold November morning and breathed the same air that the spirits in the barrels had been breathing for 104 years, and nobody said anything for a while. And the saying nothing was the correct and complete response. The question of legal ownership was settled by Kellerton's county recorder's office and a brief conversation with an attorney named Edith Graff, who specialized in property law and who had handled enough estate and acquisition cases to be unsurprised by unusual circumstances, though she acknowledged, after reviewing the deed and the vault's existence, that this was on the unusual end of her particular scale. The contents of the vault belonged to Clara. She owned the property, she owned the building on the property, and she owned everything in the building. The vault had been built as part of the building's cellar in 1931. It had not been disclosed at any subsequent sale of the property because, as Edith noted dryly, it had not been known to any subsequent seller. August Harwick's heirs had sold the building in 1947 without knowledge of the vault's existence and had received fair market value for the building as it was understood to be at that time. No claim of any kind survived that transaction. August Harwick had built it. Clara Dunmore had found it. It was hers. She went home that evening and sat at the kitchen table with that simple fact and held it for a while without doing anything with it. $471 million was hers. She said that to herself in the kitchen of the house on Maple Avenue where she had lived for 31 years and where a drafty window on the east side had been drafty since the winter before Frank's diagnosis, and which she had been meaning to have resealed for 4 years, and which was still drafty. She could have the window resealed. She understood the absurdity of thinking about the window in the context of what she was thinking about. She held on to it anyway, because the window was real and the number was still becoming real and the window was a place to start. Word moved through Kellerton the way things move through a town of 20,000. First as rumor, and then as confirmation, and then as a specific detail that people could hold in their hands. Harold Price had contacted the County Historical Society the week before, with Clara's knowledge and approval, to inform them of the vault's existence and historical significance. The Historical Society had contacted the Kellerton Courier. The Courier had run a story that was careful with the legal details and extensive with the historical ones, devoting a full inside page to the history of August Harwick and the Harwick Brewing Company and the construction in 1931 that the county building records had listed only as an addition to subgrade storage capacity. The story named the 4 men. It named Emil Dunmore. Clara read it at the kitchen table on the morning it ran, and then set the paper down carefully on the table and went to the back garden with her coffee, which she almost never did in November, and stood in the cold bare yard looking at nothing in particular for about 10 minutes. Then she went back inside and called V. I'm in the paper, she said. I know, V said. I've read it 4 times. How are you? A little strange. Naturally. Have you eaten? Not yet. I'll bring food, V said. Stay there. She ran into Rosaria Volpe at the diner on Commerce Street the following Monday morning, which was not something she had planned and which was, she thought afterward, the kind of unplanned encounter that turns out to be the right one. Rosaria was already at a table with a coffee when Clara came in for her own, And when she looked up and saw Clara, her face went through a sequence of expressions that Clara watched with the patience she had developed across 35 years of reading faces that were working through something. Rosaria said, very directly, because Rosaria had never in their 26 years of shared employment been anything but direct. Clara, I told you the building was potentially catastrophic. You did, Clara said. I told you Marjorie Fleischhauer had mentioned a structural report. You did. There was a structural report, Rosaria said. The report said the upper floor decking had experienced moisture damage and required remediation before commercial occupancy could be restored. It said nothing about the foundation or the cellar or the load-bearing walls, all of which are, according to the article in Tuesday's Courier, in remarkable condition. Clara sat down across from her. Rosaria looked at her coffee cup and then looked up. I was telling you what I thought I knew, she said. I was not wrong to be concerned, but I was not right to deliver my concern as if it were a conclusion. I have been thinking about that since Tuesday. You were being a good friend, Clara said. A good friend with incomplete information and a genuine worry. A good friend would have gone and looked at it with you. You could have, Clara said. You still can. I'll take you down to the cellar any morning you want. Bring coffee. Clara sat down across from her. Rosaria looked at her coffee cup and then looked up. I was telling you what I thought I knew, she said. I was not wrong to be concerned, but I was not right to deliver my concern as if it were a conclusion. I have been thinking about that since Tuesday. You were being a good friend, Clara said. A good friend with incomplete information and a genuine worry. A good friend would have gone and looked at it with you. You could have, Clara said. You still can. I'll take you down to the cellar any morning you want. Bring coffee. Rosaria studied her across the table with the expression of a Spanish teacher who has spent 26 years deciding when to press and when to let something settle. You are not at all what I expected you to be about this, she said. What did you expect? Honestly, I expected some version of I told you so. Clara thought about that. She thought about the vault and Emil's name in August Harwick's handwriting and Frank in the parking lot, and the $300 and the legal pad. I've been teaching long enough to know that I told you so is never the interesting part, she said. The interesting part is what happens next. Rosaria was quiet for a long moment. She turned her coffee cup between her palms, a thinking gesture Clara had watched across 26 years of faculty meetings. What has happened next, she said. For you. Not for the building. For you. Clara thought about it honestly. About the house on Maple Avenue with its resealed window. About Portugal in the spring and Scotland in the fall. About the espalier apple tree in the seed catalog folder. About Patricia calling twice a week instead of once. I plant my garden, she said. I go to Portugal. I come back. Rosaria looked at her. That's it. That's quite a lot, Clara said. For someone who spent 4 years sitting very still. Rosaria laughed. It was the real laugh, not the polite one. Clara had always been able to tell the difference. She took Rosaria to the cellar the following Thursday. Rosaria stood in front of the vault opening and looked at the 10 remaining casks in their racks, and did not say anything for a long time, and then said, in Spanish, something Clara did not catch, and when Clara asked her what she had said, she said, it was something my grandmother used to say when she saw something very old and very beautiful. It doesn't translate well. It means something like, the right hands found it. The right hands always find it eventually. Clara thought that was correct. The first item from the vault to go to auction was not a cask. It was a single bottle, chosen by Marguerite Blum as the most ideal candidate for an early sale. An intact example of a bottled-in bond Old Kellerton Reserve Rye Whiskey, 1919, provenance documented, authentication completed, condition assessed as exceptional. Marguerite's auction house ran it through their annual rare spirits sale in December in New York. Clara did not attend. She watched a live stream of the sale on her laptop at the kitchen table with V beside her and Harold Price in the chair that Frank had always used, drinking coffee and being very still. The auctioneer opened the bidding at $200,000. The bidding ran quickly through the telephone lines. One buyer in New York on the phone with the room representative, 2 others calling from outside the country. Their bids translated into figures that appeared on the screen Clara was watching in the lower right corner. She had not told herself what to expect, and she was glad she hadn't, because nothing she would have told herself would have been the right number. The bottle sold in 11 minutes of telephone bidding to a private collector in Japan for $1,200,000. Clara sat with that number for a moment. Then she got up and poured more coffee for everyone without being asked and sat back down. "One bottle," V said. "Out of approximately 2,400, Clara said. Harold Price looked at his notebook. He had been making notes throughout the live stream, and he kept making notes for a moment, and then he set his pen down and looked at the ceiling. He stayed looking at the ceiling for long enough that V said his name gently, and he said, "Sorry, I'm thinking," in the distracted voice of a man who is in fact thinking rather than apologizing. Then he said, "August Harwick bottled that whiskey in October of 1919 in this county in a building on Mill Street, and it just sold to a collector in Japan for more than most people in Kellerton will earn across an entire working life. And the bottle has not moved more than 60 feet from where it was filled. It traveled from a bottle rack to a van to a sale room in New York and back to wherever in Japan a private collector keeps something like that." He paused. "I think that is the most interesting fact I have encountered in 36 years of teaching history." The Kellerton Courier ran the auction result on the front page the following morning. The story was picked up by 3 wire services by afternoon. By the end of the week, the Harwick Brewing Company at 19 Mill Street in Kellerton, Pennsylvania was receiving calls from documentary producers in New York and historians in Philadelphia and a museum curator in Pittsburgh who wanted to discuss the possibility of a permanent exhibition relating to the vault and its contents and the history of pre-Prohibition American spirits production. Clara returned their calls in the order they had left messages, which was not the order of their prestige, and she was polite to everyone and noncommittal about everything until she had spoken to the attorney Edith Graff about what noncommittal should look like from a legal perspective. Then she had more specific conversations, with clearer terms, and she began to understand that the world was arriving at 19 Mill Street and that she was going to need to decide what she wanted the world to find there. Harold Price finished the chapter. He told her on a Tuesday morning in March, calling from Lewisburg in the cautious, pleased voice of a man who has spent 12 years not finishing something and has decided to treat finishing it as a piece of information rather than a cause for celebration, because celebrating too early was how you jinxed the revision. "The chapter is called," he said, "The Room That August Built. Industrial Wealth, Prohibition, and the Preservation of Evidence in Kellerton County, 1889 to 1932. "That's a long title," Clara said. "Academic chapters have long titles," he said. "It's a convention. The publisher apparently likes it." The chapter dedicated its acknowledgments to Emil Dunmore, Otto Brower, Joseph Kern, and Patrick Hanley, the 4 men who built the walls and kept the word. Harold had drafted the dedication language himself and read it to Clara over the phone before he submitted the manuscript, and she had said it was right, which it was. She found the families of the other 3 builders in the spring, with Harold's help and, on one occasion, with V driving and reading the map, while Clara drove and Harold sat in the back with his notebooks and said turn left in a scholarly voice. Otto Brower had 2 grandchildren still living in the county, a woman named Gertrude who taught piano lessons in Lewisburg, and a man named Carl who ran an auto body shop outside Sunbury. Joseph Kern's family had mostly dispersed, but a great-niece named Frances was living in Harrisburg, working as a librarian. Patrick Hanley had died without children, but his younger sister's daughter, a woman in her 80s named Kathleen, was still in Kellerton, in a house on Broad Street 4 blocks from where Clara had grown up. Clara visited each of them. She brought the same thing to each family. One of the bottles from the vault, wrapped in cloth the way they had been stored for 104 years, and a copy of August Harwick's letter with the passage containing their ancestor's name lightly circled in pencil, and a letter of her own that she had written and rewritten until she was satisfied that it said the right things in the right order. The letter said that their grandfather or great-grandfather or great-great-uncle had helped build something that was meant to last, and had indeed lasted, and that the lasting was not luck but craft, and that the silence they had kept was itself a form of construction, and that she wanted them to know it, and to know she knew it. Gertrude Brower, who was 63 years old and gave piano lessons on a Steinway upright in her living room, held August's letter in both hands for a long time after Clara finished reading it to her, because her eyesight had not been good for years and she could not read fine print. Then she set the letter down on her piano bench and said, very quietly, "Grandfather never once mentioned the brewery. Not once in all the years he was alive. We thought he had some unhappy memory connected to the work. He had a secret," Clara said. "I don't think it was unhappy. I think it was simply a promise kept. Gertrude picked up the bottle in its cloth wrapping and held it to her chest the way a person holds a thing they have just been told is a gift and have not yet decided whether to believe it. The piano lesson students will never believe this, she said. Kathleen Hanley, who was 83 and sat very straight in a chair in her living room on Broad Street with her hands folded in her lap, listened to the whole story from the beginning without interrupting, with the focused attention of a woman who had been listening carefully to things for 83 years and had learned that interrupting was how you missed the parts that mattered. When Clara finished, Kathleen was quiet for a moment. Patrick was the quietest man I ever knew, she said. Even as a boy, Mother used to say he could carry a secret the way other boys carried a pocket knife. Just always there, always with him, never made a show of it. He carried one for 41 years, Clara said. Kathleen nodded slowly. He would have liked that, she said. He was that kind of man. He would have found it perfectly satisfying to do a thing well and say nothing about it for 41 years. I think he thought talking about things was what you did when you hadn't done them well enough to let them speak for themselves. Clara drove home from Kathleen Hanley's house on Broad Street with all 4 windows down despite the cold because she needed the air on her face, which was wet, and she did not try to explain this to herself beyond noting that some things required cold air and open windows, and that this was one of them. She made decisions across the winter and spring. She made them carefully, and she asked for advice from the people she trusted, which was a small group. Edith Graff, the attorney, Harold Price in his scholarly capacity, and Patricia, who was now calling twice a week instead of once, and who was becoming, Clara thought, a different kind of caller, less watchful and more curious, less protective and more present. She decided to restore the brewery. This was the largest and most complex decision and the one that had been clearest to her since she had first walked through the main floor and seen the copper kettles standing in their positions. Frank had said the building was honest, that it was still doing what it had been built to do simply by standing there without pretending to be anything other than itself. She wanted to keep that. She wanted the building to remain what it was rather than become what a renovation budget could turn it into. She hired a preservation architect, a woman from Philadelphia who had worked on historical industrial buildings across the state, and who came to 19 Mill Street in February and spent 3 hours walking the main floor and the fermentation room and the upper offices before she sat down with Clara at the folding table in the former fermentation room and told her what she saw. The bones are exceptional, the architect said. The cast iron columns are sound. The limestone foundation is in better condition than most buildings a third this age. The upper floor decking needs remediation. The roof needs significant work. But the structure itself is built so well that your job is mostly to protect it rather than to repair it. Someone in 1889 made very careful decisions. Several people made careful decisions, Clara said. In 1889 and in 1931. The architect looked at her. You want to keep the vault as part of the building, she said. Not just as storage. Yes, as part of what visitors see. As part of the story of what the building is, Clara said. The building was always more than it looked like from the street. I think that should be visible now. The restoration took 14 months. The upper floor decking was replaced with matching white oak, milled from timber that the preservation architects sourced from a salvage operation in western Pennsylvania. The roof was rebuilt under the original standing seam tin profile, which the architect's team measured and replicated exactly. The cast iron columns were cleaned and treated but not painted over, which meant they retained their particular oxidized gray, the color they had been working their way toward for 135 years, and which Clara considered the correct color for a cast iron column in a building of this age. The copper kettles stayed. This was the thing that generated the most discussion among the preservation team, and the thing Clara was most immovable about. The kettles were too large to remove without dismantling them, and dismantling them would have destroyed them, and Clara would not hear of dismantling them. They had been ordered from Germany in 1891, and they had stood in their positions for 133 years, and they were going to continue standing in their positions, which was what their presence in the room had always communicated and what it was going to go on communicating. The preservation architect noted, after a moment's reflection, that there was actually no better argument for keeping them than the one Clara had just made, and that was the end of the discussion about the kettles. She established the scholarship in Frank's name in January of the second year. It was awarded annually to 2 students graduating from Kellerton High with demonstrated interest and capability in the natural sciences. The selection committee included the current head of the biology department and 2 other faculty members of Clara's choosing, and the scholarship covered 4 full years at any Pennsylvania university, which was more than Frank's salary in his last year of teaching, and which Clara thought was exactly right. She told the biology department head about the scholarship in person, sitting in the office that had been Frank's office for 22 years before he retired, which was now occupied by a young teacher named Marcus who had been Clara's student before he was Frank's colleague. Marcus listened to the terms of the scholarship and then said, with the directness of someone who was still young enough to ask the question directly, "Was this his idea or yours?" "His idea," Clara said. "He just didn't know it yet." Marcus looked at her. "He used to say," Marcus said slowly, "in my first year here when he was showing me the lab, that the best thing you could do for a student who loved science was to get out of the way of their curiosity and make sure they had access to the materials they needed to follow it wherever it went. He said curiosity was the only engine that mattered and money was just the fuel." Clara looked out the window of the biology office at the school's front lawn and the bare February trees along the street. "That's exactly what he said," she said. "He must have said it 100 times across our life together. I could hear him saying it the morning I decided on the scholarship." Marcus nodded. His eyes were bright. "We'll make it worth his name," he said. The building on Mill Street opened to the public on a Saturday morning in October, exactly 2 years after Clara had parked in the gravel lot and unlocked the main doors with the 3rd key on a ring of 9. She had not made an announcement. She had put a small notice in the Kellerton Courier 3 days before, and she had told Harold Price and V and Patricia and Edith Graff and the members of the Historical Society and Rosaria Volpe, who had become a regular visitor to the restoration project during the 14 months of the work, and who had at some point stopped being someone Clara had to convince of the building's worth and become someone who needed very little convincing about anything. The first person through the main door on Saturday morning was Kathleen Hamley, who was now 84 and who had agreed to come only if someone drove her, and who had been driven by her granddaughter, who was 26, and who looked at the copper kettles when she walked in and stood still in the middle of the main floor with her mouth slightly open. Clara watched her. She had forgotten what the kettles looked like to someone seeing them for the first time, because she had spent 14 months of restoration work looking at them every day, and they had become, the way things do when you are with them long enough, simply present rather than astonishing. The young woman looking at the kettles reminded her that the kettles were astonishing. 9 feet tall, 5 of them, green and brown from 133 years of unchanged exposure to the same air. They had been ordered from Germany in 1891 by a man who believed in making things for the long term, and they had stood in these positions ever since, and they were going to stand in these positions considerably longer. The granddaughter looked at Clara. She said, "What did they make in those?" "Beer," Clara said. "From 1891 until the last day of operations in 1981. And then they just stood here waiting." "Waiting for what?" "I'm not sure yet," Clara said. "I think they're still waiting. But I think they're patient about it." The granddaughter smiled and followed her grandmother toward the fermentation room. Kathleen moved past the kettles with the unhurried deliberateness of someone who has been carrying a thing for a long time and is arriving at the place where it can be set down. She went through the main floor and down the fermentation room and through the heavy oak door and down the 14 steps, and she stood at the vault entry. The rotating section propped open the way it would be on visiting days, and she looked into the vault. The vault was not empty. The majority of the spirits collection had been cataloged and removed for auction over the preceding 12 months, the casks going to buyers in Japan and Scotland and Kentucky, the bottles distributed across the major spirit sale rooms of New York and London. But Clara had kept 10 of the casks. She had consulted with Marguerite Blum about which 10, and Marguerite had helped her identify 10 casks that represented the full range of the collection and whose retention would serve both historical and educational purposes, which was the language the preservation architect had helped her use in the documents establishing the vault as a preserved historical space. The 10 casks sat in their racks. The wooden shelving on the back wall held 20 bottles, individually identified with small handwritten labels. The wooden chest, empty now of its bullion but preserved in its original position under the lowest shelf, carried a small framed card explaining what it had held and where the gold had gone, which was into a fund administered by the Historical Society for the Preservation of Industrial Heritage Sites across the county. On the near wall of the vault, to the right of the rotating entry section, a framed document was mounted at eye level. It was a copy of a page from the county construction records for July of 1931, the page that listed the addition to subgrade storage capacity and the 4 names of the private crew. The names were in the original typeface of the county records, and beside them, in a caption panel below the frame, was a brief description of who each man had been and what he had contributed. Emil Dunmore, Slovak immigrant, fermentation floor worker, one of 4 men who built the vault in the summer and fall of 1931 and whose silence preserved it for 90 years. Kathleen Hanley stood in front of the framed document for a long time. Her granddaughter stood a few steps back, giving her room. Clara stood at the vault entry. After a while, Kathleen said, without turning around, Patrick would have said it was too much. He would have said he was just doing the work. He was just doing the work, Clara said. And so was Emil. And the work lasted 100 years. Kathleen turned. She looked at Clara with the steady eyes of someone who has had 84 years to develop a very reliable sense of people. Your grandfather would have said the same thing mine would have said, Kathleen said. Probably, Clara said. They were that kind of men. Do you think they talked about it? Kathleen said. Among themselves? After it was done? Clara thought about that honestly. For men who had built a vault in secret and walked away from it, and said nothing about it for 40 years or more. Whether they had found each other on the street in those years, and passed what they both knew in a look or a nod. Whether Emil Dunmore had ever stood at the grocery store across from Patrick Hanley and held the silence between them like the thing it was. I think they talked about everything else, she said, and I think that was enough for them. I think the talking about everything else was how they kept the other thing. Kathleen nodded slowly. She reached out and touched the frame holding the county document. Just once, with 2 fingers, the way you touch something you want to have touched without disturbing it. The day ended the way days at the building had ended every day for 2 years. Clara at the main entrance in the late afternoon, locking the doors with the 3rd key on the ring. The sky over Kellerton had gone dark early the way October skies do in Pennsylvania, when the season has decided it is done being autumn and is moving toward what comes next. The gravel lot was empty. Mill Street was quiet. She stood outside the main entrance for a moment with the keys in her hand and looked up at the limestone arch. Harwick. 1889. She had stood in this spot 2 years ago with the keys in her hand on a Tuesday morning in October and a measuring tape in her coat pocket and a chalk stick she had bought at the hardware store the night before. She had stood here and breathed in the smell of the building and thought about Frank pointing at the loading dock and thought about Emil saying the work was done. She had been right that something was here. She had not known what it was or how large it was or what it would mean for the rest of her life. She had only known that the building was worth looking at and that nobody else was going to look. She had known that the work was done and that someone needed to find it and that the someone might as well be her. $471 million had been sealed in the ground under 19 Mill Street for 90 years. It had been sealed there by a careful and lonely man in August of 1932, and it had been kept there by 4 men who had given their word and by the packed earth of a Pennsylvania cellar and by the limestone walls that Emil Dunmore and Otto Brower and Joseph Kern and Patrick Hanley had laid with their own hands. The money was not all gone. Most of the auction proceeds had been distributed across the year according to a plan Clara had developed with Edith Graff and revised twice before she was satisfied with it. Frank's scholarship at Kellerton High, the County Heritage Fund administered by the Historical Society, educational endowments at 3 regional universities, a fund for the maintenance of the building in perpetuity, contributions to organizations she had been meaning to support for years and had not had the means to. She had kept enough for herself. She was not going to pretend that keeping some of it was shameful. Frank's medical bills were gone. The drafty window on the east side of the house had been resealed, which had cost $350 and had been the first thing she spent on herself after the first auction check cleared, which she knew was an absurd way to spend the first money from a vault worth $471 million, and which she had done anyway, because the window had been drafty for 4 years and Frank had always said they would get to it. She was going to travel. V was coming with her. They had agreed on Portugal in the spring and Scotland in the fall. Scotland because of the Scotch whiskey casks in the vault, and because Harold Price had pointed out that 3 of the barrels had been distilled at a Scottish distillery that was still operating. which meant there was a specific address to visit, and Harold Price was also coming. She was going to finish the garden renovation she had been planning since the second year of Frank's illness and had let sit in a folder of notes and seed catalogs since the funeral. She was going to tear out the back fence that had been leaning since the previous winter and put in a proper one. She was going to plant the espalier apple tree against the back wall that she had been drawing and redrawing in the seed catalog margins for 5 years. These were small things. She understood that in any accounting of what $471 million could do, an espalier apple tree against the back fence was a small thing. She was going to plant it anyway, because a garden was where you put what you were going to tend, and tending was what she knew how to do. She stood at the main entrance of the Harwick Brewing Company in the October dusk with the keys in her hand, and the limestone arch above her, and the carved name that had been there for 137 years and was going to be there for considerably longer if she had anything to say about it. She thought about August Harwick writing in August of 1932 that the only thing he regretted was the secrecy, that it had been a lonely way to carry a thing. She thought about her grandfather Emil, 23 years old in a photograph, arms crossed, cap pushed back, standing in front of this same arch in 1927 with 9 other men and a confidence in the camera that she recognized now as the confidence of a man who was doing what he knew how to do and doing it well, and did not need to explain this to anyone, including the camera. He had built a vault with his hands and kept his word with his silence and left both in the ground for someone to find. She had found them. She thought about Frank in the parking lot, for years before his diagnosis, pointing at the loading dock with the particular pleasure of a man sharing something he understood well and was glad you were there. Every inch of it was thought about. He had been right. He had been more right than he knew, which was a thing she was going to be sitting with for the rest of her life, and which she did not find sad. She found it, of all the unexpected things that the last 2 years had given her, the most sustaining. Frank had looked at this building on a Saturday afternoon and seen the care in it. He had been looking at $471 million in a cellar, and what he had seen was the thought that went into it. He had seen the right thing. He had always seen the right thing. She locked the door. She put the keys in her coat pocket. She walked to her car across the gravel lot that was no longer a patch of weeds and loose stone, but a properly laid surface of river gravel with good drainage. One of the first things the preservation architect had insisted on, and which Clara had been grateful for every morning since. And she drove home up Maple Avenue in the October dark. The silver maple out front had begun dropping its leaves again. It was that time of year. The kitchen light was on, which meant V had let herself in with the key Clara had given her 18 months ago, and which meant there was food on the stove and probably a bottle of something on the table, because V had not allowed Clara to eat alone more than twice in the past 2 years and was not, as far as Clara could tell, planning to start. She sat in the car in the drive for a moment before she went in. She thought about $300. She thought about the ring of 9 brass keys in her coat pocket and the one of them that fit the main doors. She thought about a retired schoolteacher in a folding chair raising her hand in a county courthouse on a cold October morning while every other person in the room looked at their phones. She thought about what it cost to press your palm against a stone wall in the cold and wait to feel something different. Not much, she thought. Not much at all. She got out of the car and went inside. The kitchen was warm and smelled of whatever V had made, which turned out to be the white bean soup with rosemary that V made in October and November because she believed firmly in the restorative properties of white beans and refused to be argued with about it. There was a bottle of the Portuguese wine V had found at the shop on Commerce Street that they had been working through since the summer. Clara took off her coat. She hung the keys on the hook by the door. She sat down at the kitchen table across from V, who was reading something on her phone and did not look up immediately, which was the comfortable behavior of a person who knows you well enough to let you arrive at your own pace. V looked up. How was it? Good, Clara said. Kathleen came with her granddaughter. The granddaughter saw the kettles and couldn't move for a minute. V smiled. Good kettles will do that. Good kettles will do that, Clara agreed. V poured wine into both glasses and pushed one across the table. They sat in the kitchen on Maple Avenue in the October dark and did not say much for a while, which was its own kind of conversation, the kind that only works between people who have been friends long enough to understand that the silence is not empty. Clara thought about $300. She thought about the ring of 9 brass keys on the hook by the door and the one of them that fit the main doors. She thought about a retired schoolteacher in a folding chair raising her hand in a county courthouse on a cold October morning while every other person in the room looked at their phones. She thought about what it costs to press your palm against a stone wall in the cold and wait to feel something different. Not much, she thought. Not much at all. Stories like this remind us that starting over is terrifying, but it is always possible. If you or someone you love is facing a total reset right now, whether from a divorce, a loss, or a financial disaster, you need a plan. Scan the QR code on your screen or click the link below to get the Phoenix Blueprint for just $17. It gives you the exact steps you need to take in the first 48 hours and a 90-day plan to get your independence back. Thank you for watching.